Good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to, or welcome back to Matt on Books. This is my second episode of Friends on Books, where I get three other people together who I am interested in talking to. And this time it's ladies' night. I thought the first one I did was a sausage fest, so I would balance it out by getting only ladies on this time. And in the future, it can just be mixed. We'll see. Probably everybody who's interested in looking at my channel knows who the three of you are, but why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Jordan from Jordan Reads. I have a predominantly fantasy sci-fi channel, but I read a few other things, but it's mostly fantasy sci-fi. Excited to be here.
I'm Tori from the channel Tori Talks. I also mostly focus on fantasy and just cool character-driven storytelling in general. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Yay. And I'm Johanna from the channel Johanna, and I mostly focus on fantasy. I do read other genres from time to time, but fantasy is mostly my focus. And I'm so happy to be here, Matt, because I've been an admirer for a while. And it's also wonderful to be here with Jordan and Tori, because I feel like there are some of us who are female adult fantasy people on BookTube. And I don't feel like, I don't know, as much is known about us, I think, as some of our male counterparts. Now, it's different in YA fantasy.
Yes.
But I feel like with adult,
what is that? I mean, YA is a very female thing, it seems. I'm over 50 and I'm male, and I just don't relate to teenage characters that well anymore. I mean, but like YA is a really very female thing, isn't it?
it is.
It's like a marketing thing, especially like in the publishing industry. They just push like so much adult women fantasy is still marketed as YA just so people will buy it.
Yeah.
I wonder about that too, though, because there didn't used to be a YA section when I was young, and or a very small one, if there was, and not fantasy anyway. I mean, there was YA, but not fantasy YA.
Yeah.
And now it's exploded. And I think it's because of the Twilight craze, I'm going to guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what sort of differentiates, or what marketing strategists have labeled as more YA than adult, I really think comes down to the romantic subplot. And I think that there's still a huge stigma against men liking romance in general. And even some of us females, we're not always crazy about, romantic subplots. But yeah, exactly. I think why we tend to gravitate more towards adult fantasy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd be curious to hear more answers to that question too.
Yeah,
it's like a very stigmatized thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also like to say, just for everybody joining us in the chat, if you have questions for any of us or all of us, write them down. I'll try and keep track, and I'll pop them up there. Caitlin is here. Juliana is here. Patrick is here. Kevin is here.
Yeah, and that's like why I took so long to get into adult fantasy, because it was just kind of like I read YA for a long, like until very recently almost, because I just felt like it was like I just assumed all adult fantasy would be like Game of Thrones, and that I was not going to be welcome in that space. So it was just kind of like a weird thing. And then I was like, wait, there's so much other stuff besides just like medieval fantasy. Not that medieval fantasy is not good, but I just assumed that's what it would all be.
As a big fan of George R.R. Martin's work, I would like to say, Jordan, you specifically are indeed welcome in that space.
Why, thank you.
Yeah,
I don't hate Game of Thrones. I've read them. I assumed that all adult fantasy would be just like that. It's like the common misconception.
Well, if you feel intimidated by A Song of Ice and Fire, can I tell you about our Lord and Savior Stephen Erickson?
I'm doing a read along of
It's the worst kept secret
starting in January.
Yeah, Kevin says he's here for the Malazan talk. So who has read Malazan complete?
I'm starting in January. I have not read it.
Okay.
I've read the 10 book series I've completed.
The main 10 book. Yeah, exactly.
The still not books yet.
I've gotten through House of Chains.
Only that far. Ah, okay. So
Yeah,
you lied a little bit when you put up your hand for the
well, you at hand. You said who had read Malazan, and I was like, oh, me. And then you said all 10, and I dropped my hand. So I'm
okay.
good. I promise.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I got through the end of House of Chains and a little bit into Midnight Tides. But I read the first 3, I want to say it's been almost 10 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of become the backbone of my channel is I'm doing this. I'm reading everything. And I was actually just before we got on, I was looking at the list because I'd never really counted it. And it's 29 books.
Yeah.
6 are novellas. Yeah, they're actually quite short. Like one of those I just read recently, and it was like sat down for 2-3 hours and I was done. But that's 23 chunky novels.
I didn't even know that until literally yesterday because I was doing a chat with a few other booktubers, including Philip Chase, and he started talking about like all of the other books, and I was like, "Wait, there's more than just 10?" Because
don't worry about it. Just ignore
excited.
it. I do everything I can to get people excited about reading Malazan, and saying that there's 29 books is not exciting. Unless for some reason you have no TBR. But yeah, no, there's the 10 books. And then if you really like those, like me, you can read around and it fills out more of the details, more of the stuff going on in the world, and more depth on certain characters or places or whatever. But yeah, they're certainly not required. I said recently I did a review of Memories of Ice, the 3rd book, and I said read up to there. Like if you wanna be committed to really giving it a try, read that far. If after Memories of Ice you are not excited and emotionally wrecked, then Malazan is not for you. I think that's enough to really know I gave it a good try and it's not for me.
I say a little bit differently. I agree. I understand the logic behind at least get through Memories of Ice, because each of those first 3 books give you such a very vastly different sort of approach to the series, and it kind of is representative of what you're going to get in the series. But at the same time, I think because after seeing Johann's video for Library of a Viking, I saw he did not connect with Gardens of the Moon, and he did not connect very well with Dead House Gates. And at that point, I think, no, you're done. Like, if you didn't connect at all to those first 2 books, don't even bother with Memories of Ice. I don't think it's going to change your mind. But if you really enjoy, because I feel like people are kind of mixed. It's like people either love Gardens of the Moon and maybe were so-so on Dead House Gates or didn't love it as much, or the flip, where they didn't really love Gardens of the Moon, thought it was okay, loved Dead House Gates. And then if you're one of those 2 people, then move on to Memories of Ice and then decide. But for me, I'm one of the weirdos where I loved Gardens of the Moon. It was just unlike anything else I'd ever experienced.
You are a weirdo.
I know. I loved it though. I just absolutely adored it. And then with Dead House Gates, I had a tough time getting into it, honestly. And it wasn't until like the end, then the end completely blew me away, because how does it not? And then I wasn't sure, because I did get something very different than what I was expecting in Dead House Gates. And I didn't know anything at the time. I didn't know if I would continue on, honestly. But then months later, I couldn't stop thinking about Dead House Gates, and I couldn't stop thinking about characters and things that happened. And then I watched a couple of videos talking about Malazan in a different way than I was thinking of it. And then I was like committed after that. And then I went to Memories of Ice, and yeah, I was broken after that.
Yeah, Memories of Ice will wreck you.
Yes.
Definitely stock up on Kleenex, Jordan.
Yeah, I'm an easy crier, so
I almost wish I could. I guess it's sort of a cliche with guys, but I don't feel like I'm emotionally repressed or anything, but I just don't cry ever about anything. But I do
I
get
cry
emotionally
watching
moved.
like commercials, so I'll
Yeah.
cry anytime.
Okay. I mean, I have an emotional reaction. Like I'll get choked up. It's not like I
Yeah.
don't feel anything. It's just like when people talk about literal water coming out of their eyes, I'm like, I'm not sure. I know it exists, but I don't do it.
I don't. I think that my last like big cry in a book was. It's probably been a bit. I think it was when I reread Song of Achilles. That's that book every time. It's just
Song of Achilles. When I
A
finished
puddle.
Song of Achilles, especially on the last page, I was like,
That
okay,
oh.
like if I was the kind of person who could cry easily, I'd be a wreck on the floor right now.
My husband like rushed into the room and was like, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And I was like, "This book." He was like, "Oh my god!" He like walked out. I was a wreck. Yeah. But
Yeah,
I did read. I just read Fool's Errand with Alex over on Tall Guy Reads, and I teared up, but I didn't fully cry. I had to close the book and sit there for a while, staring at the wall, but I didn't cry.
I'm thinking hard because this, like me getting into BookTube has been really weird. Like about 3 or 4 months ago, I started watching people. I didn't know 4 months ago. I didn't know BookTube existed. And then I subscribed to way too many people and just had this sort of constant flood of people talking about books. I thought it was pretty amazing. And I got a little excited about like all of these new things that I'd never really heard of. And, you know, things that are really big on BookTube are not necessarily really big.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Universally. So everybody's talking about Fonda Lee, and I'd never heard of Fonda Lee. Everybody's talking about John Gwynne. I'd never heard of John Gwynne. So I made myself a stack of, hey, these look cool, newer things. But lately I've been thinking about rereading a lot of stuff because I've been reading fantasy for a long time. And I'm almost thinking next year is going to be almost only rereading.
Nice.
Just
going
through the Malazan 10. There's a Song of Ice and Fire reread starting.
Yay.
Johanna's
I'm excited.
organizing that starting in January. I've been wanting to reread Lord of the Rings for the 14th time. I think that kind of thing. Let me go through some of the comments. Caitlin, I am really sorry that anyone ever told you that you shouldn't be reading fantasy because you're female. That is stupid.
Our small brains can't comprehend.
No, it's got to have romance and a teenage female protagonist.
Yeah.
So
But it is true too
lovers.
that adult fantasy is, I feel like it's very male dominated, like the fandoms and things like that.
Yeah.
I have a couple of friends, Brittany from Books with Brittany and Ola from Wild Witch, and we've done a couple of videos on the female perspective in Malazan because we just felt like there were so few of us reading that series. And it was interesting because, I just don't see, even like there, I didn't really do videos on all of my Malazan reads. I started doing videos from books 4 on. And I would say the majority of my commenters were male commenters.
Yep.
And yet, at the same time, I have to say, like, some of my favorite characters of all time, but especially female characters, are in that series.
Yep.
It's just incredible.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the first. I mean, I'm probably a kind of, I don't know, maybe stereotypical man of my age. Yeah. I'm white. I've got all of the privilege. And I read fantasy for a long time, and pretty much everything I read was male authors with primarily male protagonists. You know, and it used to be before the 90s, there were female fantasy authors around, but they were definitely largely in the minority. Yeah, there weren't that many. You know, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, whatever. There were a few around, but it was almost all men. And that's changed a lot lately. And I've actually been sort of actively looking like, give me a female author, give me female characters, give me like gender stuff going on that isn't the mainstream stuff, you know? And I've read some books lately, like probably my favorite book of the year, The Counselor.
Oh, I want to read that.
So good. And it does what Erickson does in Malazan as well. In Malazan, women doing anything isn't pointed out. It's just normal.
Just
Just
is.
normalized.
It's
Yeah.
just like everybody is the gender equality is to the, you know, there are men that are horrible to women, there are women who are horrible to men, but
Mhm.
there's no sort of systematic standard of discrimination. And also, like, some people are pretty light colored, some people are very dark, and nobody cares. Some people are homosexual, bisexual, straight, whatever, nobody cares. It's just normal. And it's the same in The Counselor.
That's
It's-
awesome. You know, it's interesting because oh, I'm so sorry, Jordan.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I started paying attention this year, and I don't know what brought my attention to it, but I realized this last year, I feel like almost every book I've been reading has been from a male perspective. Like every single one, Gentlemen Bastards. I just finished Sons of Darkness, and like just every book, and even the ones written by female authors, which is really weird. So I read the Farseer trilogy, and that's like Fitz's perspective. And I read 2 Jenny Wirtz books, and they both have to do with 2 male protagonists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really interesting because, you know, with adult fantasy, not just the male authors are focusing on male characters, but even a lot of female authors focus a lot on male characters. And
yeah, I wonder how much like publishing has to do with that. Like, are they not picking up? Like, are they just like, oh, this won't sell? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I've always wondered if it's like a publishing thing, where they're like, I don't know if this will sell with a female protagonist. In the adult
I can
fantasy
then
genre.
recommend 2 books. The Counselor, I already said. Female author, female protagonist. She's the female character who we get everything from her perspective is really interesting, extremely flawed, but really, really interesting. And what I'm reading right now is City of Lies, because I'm doing Oztober, and these are both Australian authors. Sam is Samantha, so it's a female author as well. It's 2 POVs, a brother and sister, and they trade chapters. So one's the brother, the next one's the sister, and then it's the brother. So one of the characters in this 50% of the book is a female POV, and
Nice.
also very good. So, yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting just from like me moving from, because I originally on BookTube at least kind of tried starting in more the YA fantasy realm, and very quickly realized that that was not my sphere. I have read several YA books that I love. Usually they're the darker, grittier YA books, which was kind of my instant lead into adult fantasy. Like 6 of Crows is one of my favorite YAs.
So good.
YAs.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like when I first got into adult fantasy, I was in college, early 20s. I read Mistborn and Karen Miller's Hammer of God trilogy. I don't know if you guys have heard of that one. And that blew my mind a little bit because it was so much deeper, and it wasn't all about this very toxic romance is incredibly prevalent in YA, which is one of the reasons I lit out of there. And I don't know, like I read Malazan actually. I picked up Gardens of the Moon. I don't even remember why. I think I was at a bookstore looking for a random fantasy book. I was watching your BookTube video that you recently did, Jordan, and the idea of just like walking into a bookstore and grabbing something because it looked interesting. And so I went from like Mistborn straight into Malazan, which at the time was, I'm kind of amazed that I loved it as much as I did, and I think
that's a
huge jump.
It is a huge jump.
I'm really proud of you and impressed.
Well, you know what it was though? It was funny because Gardens of the Moon is not my favorite of the 4 that I have read, but what pulled me into the story was actually one of the female characters. Tattersail was the first thing that I loved about Malazan. And in Dead House Gates, which is, whoops, wrong side. Where is that? Over there. Is my favorite fantasy book of all time, largely due to the arc of one of the female characters in the story. And I could talk about that for ages, about how it hit me at the right time in my life to have an incredible amount of impact. And I bawled. I don't cry very easily in books, and that's why usually the books that make me cry get an instant 5 stars. Because
always a 5-star.
If you can pull that emotion out of me, you're doing something right. And I've cried in 3 of the 4 Malazan books that I've read. So Karsa made me cry, which was kind of not weird. I don't know what that says
Karsa
about.
made you cry.
Yeah.
Like,
More
did
on
he
that
punch
later.
you or what?
Probably. He came through the book. Yes.
Oh, I love Karsa.
Karsa.
I love
one of
Karsa,
My
but I
favorite
never.
characters ever.
He
He never
makes
made me
you
cry
question
though.
everything
I was
you
never
think you know
even
about
slightly
yourself.
choked up about anything Karsa did, except
He made
like
me laugh
thinking,
on it. Well,
you
Yeah, he makes me
asshole.
laugh a lot. Yeah.
Well, he
Yeah,
didn't really
yeah,
make me
laughing
laugh in the
short.
beginning,
Yeah,
but
Tattersail is a incredible female character. I loved her like crazy in Gardens of the Moon. And I think I've always been a tomboy. And so for me, the male perspectives in a lot of the books that I read, I relate to honestly more than a lot of the female perspectives. So the female characters, I've been waiting to do a video on my channel of my favorite female fantasy characters because I want to have a big enough list to actually do it
yeah.
some credit. But yeah, I'm gonna try also not to have the entire list be Malazan characters.
That would be
maybe
my
a few of
problem.
them.
That would be here's the thing about characters in Malazan. I agree with you, Tori, and like I know exactly what character you're talking about for Death on Skates that choked you up, and
Yep.
we're gonna have to talk about that sometime.
Favorite line of all time is in her arc.
She is. I mean, we want to stay away from spoilers, especially
Yes.
since one of our guests has not read it yet.
No
but,
idea.
I'm trying to be careful.
I of course know which character in Dead House Gates you're talking about as well, and that is actually, at least in what I've seen, the most talked about character in all 10 books.
Probably, yeah.
And you know, she's very controversial.
Very.
A lot of people have a lot of really interesting opinions,
Yep.
positive and negative.
Yeah.
And yeah, she's a real. I'm very. I always love watching people who haven't read it read it. I'm so looking forward to your videos, Jordan.
Yeah,
because it's such a. I mean, it's also in the Ola says same thing. Tori Tattersail. Philip Chase is Herr Professor Dr. Chase is more in touch with his emotions than I am, and is well known for crying when he reads Malazan.
my husband is an emotional reader as well. I think he cries in books more than I do, and Malazan has definitely made him use a box of tissues in the past as well.
Yeah, Ola says that Stephen Erickson did a great job. Everyone has an equally dark and shitty ride.
Yeah. So the thing is with
true.
with Malazan characters, I think you see a number of really powerful ones, even just from Gardens of the Moon. However, I have to say that the characters, I don't think, I don't know, it's hard to say there are probably a million exceptions, including the one in Dead House Gates we're talking about, but
We're not talking about.
that we're not talking about but it wasn't until the second half of the series where I just suddenly realized so many of these characters in this series, and maybe it just didn't hit me until the second half of the series where I realized so many characters in this series are my favorite characters of all time. And I can't really even tell you exactly why, except that like with the female characters especially, he had a way of making them feel more real to me than any other female characters I've read in fantasy. And that was something that I realized recently, is that, especially as I've just mentioned, that I've been reading a lot of fantasy that has a lot of male perspectives, even from female fantasy authors. And the thing was, there was, of course, adult fantasy when I was a teenager. And I think there are a lot of reasons I didn't read more adult fantasy or even any fantasy, because like I said, there wasn't even YA fantasy when I was a teenager. But I think one of the reasons I struggled with the fantasy in general as a teenager was that I never really saw a lot of female representation in fantasy. You know, when you pick up David Eddings or Elric or even Lord of the Rings, I mean, you have some female characters, but they're very idealized. And I feel like that's not really the focus. The focus is usually on the male perspective. And so what Erickson does with the female perspective in Malazan, and I have to say, A Song of Ice and Fire was actually probably that's why it won my heart, because suddenly I had female perspectives and multiple female perspectives. And I didn't have that before. So I felt like even though I know that there are things that could be criticized about some of the way he handles female perspectives.
Yeah.
For me, it filled a huge void I didn't even know I needed in my fantasy reading.
Well, there's such a wide variety of female characters in A Song of Ice and Fire and in Malazan as well. Like, you know, I feel like there's something for every type of woman to relate to. I mean, Brienne of Tarth is not shockingly my favorite female character in A Song
She's
of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
She's amazing.
Phenomenal.
Arya is great. I loved her. But I also found myself like kind of reflecting more on types of characters that maybe I don't relate to as heavily, but like Sansa's arc is another good one that really like I really was feeling drawn into her character so much more, even though I didn't necessarily relate to her as the same type of person. So I just think there's the variety in the Song of Ice and Fire was something I really appreciated.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I stuck with YA for so long. It's just because I felt represented. I felt like I was reading about other women. And so I was like, I don't want to go to adult fantasy and like not see myself anymore, you know? So
yeah.
Same here, Jordan, because when I got back into reading fantasy again, after a long break, and even after a break after A Song of Ice and Fire, I discovered BookTube, and most of what I discovered was YA fantasy, and a lot of female authors, and I started getting into that too. And it was for that reason. I'm like, I am definitely not the demographic. I'm a bit older, but at the same time, it was like I finally saw female perspectives in fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was also why Gardens of the Moon hit me so hard, because I saw, Tattersail, as you mentioned, Tori, and Absalar. I'm sorry, I'm failing to remember names now, but I remember just felt like, thank you. Yeah. And so I just remember thinking, this has the tone and the atmosphere and the type of intrigue that I'm looking for, the kind of depth I'm looking for. And we have female characters. And I didn't have that before in any of my reading in many years. So that's why I think it was like so meaningful for me.
And not only are they just present, but they are in Malazan. A lot of the, I guess maybe importance, not the word, but there's a lot of the most important characters are women.
Yes.
The ones that have the biggest effect or influence on what's going on a lot of them are female. So yeah.
I just recently DNF'd Wheel of Time because of how frustrating he writes women and gender in general. Like I was like, I just can't anymore. I can't. I got halfway through Fires of Heaven, and I was like, I am not enjoying this one bit.
Jordan, give me a high five. Yeah. Give me a high five. I DNF'd the first book of Wheel of Time twice.
I tried so hard. I wanted to like it so bad, and I was like, what is this weird writing style? Like the way he basically it all boils down to people do not understand the other gender at all, and it's brought up every 5 minutes. I don't know why she did that, because she's a woman. Like, it was just like constant, and I was like, what is, no one thinks like this, no one acts like this. The wheels fell off.
Good one here, Dr. Professor. Like I said, I like 4 months ago, I didn't even know BookTube existed, and I didn't know there were people out there like publicly talking about books. So I was just kind of navigating my own way through, I want to find this and I want to read that, and I'm not interested in that, whatever. I didn't have anybody to listen to or talk to about it. And the first time I tried the Wheel of Time, and maybe I'm starting to think it's maybe a generational thing. Like there's a lot of people who essentially as fantasy readers grew up on the Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
And that's like 20 years after I started reading fantasy. So I grew up in Lord of the Rings. And as someone who grew up in Lord of the Rings and has read it more than 10 times, I open up the first book of the Wheel of Time and I'm like, you've got to be shitting me.
Drivel.
Really? not even drivel. I was just like, how transparently can you rip off Tolkien? And
I've heard that, yeah.
And I've heard it evolves, and of course it becomes its own thing, and the world isn't like one-to-one Tolkien or anything, but you've got 4 people who come from an idyllic village who get chased away from their idyllic village by black cloaked people on horrible, evil horses. And I was just like, this is just the flight from the Shire. This is the beginning of the Lord of the Rings. Like, blurry and badly written. And I was like,
almost,
but people talk about it and it was successful. There's got to be something. So I pushed on. I got like halfway through the book twice, and I was like, I'm not enjoying this.
Well, it doesn't get better, I can tell you. Because everyone was like, after book 5, there's going to be kind of a slog. And I was like, wait, it's all been a slog. I'm not enjoying it. So I was like, I gotta stop reading it. It's almost guaranteed, though, if there is a gender-based magic system, I'm not going to like it, most likely. It has to be done really well for me to enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who is actually male, being introduced to a world where like women can do all of the wonderful things and men are inherently evil because they're male, I was also like, yeah, okay, it's an idea. It's not one I enjoy spending a lot of time with, but okay, whatever.
Yeah, he just doesn't. He does not understand gender dynamics at all.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is, it's like kind of, I mean, he wrote that bad. Yay. But yeah, that's kind of the nice thing about Erickson's books, especially considering some of them were written. I guess, when was the last one written? Do you know? I mean, not God is Not Willing, but The Crippled God.
The Crippled Gods. I can't reach it right now, so I can't check,
like
but I'll look it up.
Probably 2019. Anyway, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is it's nice about, and I'm glad that Malazan is getting a lot more attention, because the sad thing about a lot of these series is it sets precedent and normalizes this is what's normal in fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I think we're trying to evolve some of our thoughts on, basically on gender and gender norms and things like that. And that is something that I have to say, that going through my phase of reading a lot of YA fantasy, that I really appreciate, is that I felt like I learned a lot about gender norms from YA fantasy, of all things.
Yeah.
Like, it does it well. It really does it well. It does representation right.
Yeah, I don't read a lot of YA fantasy anymore, but it still gets me very frustrated when people like just always write it off as like not as literary. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say, but like it's not as it doesn't have as much merit, and it's like it does though. It does a lot of great things. It's just different.
Yeah.
Crippled God was 2011.
Okay.
I just looked it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that was. I've read a lot of fantasy, and I've been reading it for a long time, so I've read a fair bit of old stuff.
Yeah.
Which maybe a lot of younger people haven't. But Malazan was the first thing I think I ever read. I don't know if it was, I'm not saying it's the first thing ever published like this, but it was the first thing I ever read where women and men were like default just equal. Nobody thinks about it. Who you want to sleep with, nobody thinks about it. It's just like a world where color doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter, sexual preference doesn't matter. Yeah, but also it's not. I've seen this in other books, and it feels like they're going out of their way with the story to make a political point,
right?
Which gets a little overbearing and tiring.
I loved your rant about that book.
That book got me so angry.
I haven't read it. I actually thank you and other booktubers for opening up a slot in my TBR.
I think I can understand why people like it. I don't think it's an awful book. It just really did not work for me.
I haven't heard anyone say it's an awful book, but they said that the first half was quite good.
I loved the first
and then it
part.
changes, and the last half was kind of like, yeah.
Weird.
Okay.
The strange thing about that book is that it seems, at least in this corner of book 2, it seems like everybody had a universal. Well, with the exception, I mean, some people really didn't like it, like Jordan. But it seems like we all agree that when the plot got going was when it suffered.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of the funny thing.
The like slow beginning was much more enjoyable than
Everybody's like, oh, I love this slice of life thing. Wait, there's a plot? What are you doing?
Yeah, it was, I felt like Stephen King was like I guess I went into it expecting something different, which is on me. I was expecting it to be like a really dark fairy tale. Like I was really looking for like that dark, scary Stephen King fairy tale, and it was more like, it felt more like a YA coming of age story, and which is fine. It just was not what I was.
It actually
expecting.
did feel really YA. I hadn't thought about that before, but
yeah,
I think it could have been marketed that way.
Yeah, it totally could have.
Yeah, it's. I mean, other than Jordan, it seemed like almost everybody had the same opinion.
Yes.
Yeah, it was so consistent, and I'm in Germany, but I can read German books, but I don't like it. I don't enjoy it, so I always order my books in English. And I pre-ordered Fairy Tale, and luckily, because I'm in Germany, it was going to take 2 weeks longer than the pre-orders in the US. So I saw all of these reviews, and I was like, I think I'll cancel my pre-order.
I went and I
don't need it right now.
I got my pre-order after I had already listened to the audiobook, so I went and returned it and got Wall of Storms.
What about you, Tori? Did you read it?
I haven't read Fairy Tale. I've actually never in my life read a Stephen King book.
Wow.
Okay, I'm kicking you out.
I'm sorry.
You're out of here.
I have kind of a weird, like, genesis into fantasy, I think, because I did not grow up with a lot of the fantasy series that a lot of my peers have read in childhood and have that kind of nostalgic value, other than Narnia. Narnia was the one that, obviously I grew up with that, and the old like BBC adaptation of it.
I saw that too. Yeah.
It's still such a classic. But I never read Harry Potter, still have never read it. I've never actually read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit.
Now you're definitely out of here.
I know. I'm really thinking myself in
you're
right
fired.
now. And I haven't read Wheel of Time. Like a lot of these like big nostalgic series. That one I have tried Eye of the World like Matt a couple of times and was just like, I couldn't do it.
Okay, you're allowed to stay now.
Thanks. Hey,
I will say the second one.
I love Malazan, so I'm pointing
the second Wheel of Time is better than the first, but not enough to continue.
Yeah. So I actually kind of have been enjoying that because I missed a lot of the like nostalgic love that a lot of people have from childhood readings of these series, but I'm kind of coming into it with a completely fresh take, I think, in a lot of ways. And my love of fantasy is actually born from books like, they're more classics, like Frankenstein by Shelley and White Fang by Jack London, and a lot of books that made me care about really deep, dark, like profound stories.
Yeah.
And that's what I've brought forward into loving fantasy. And one of the reasons I think Malazan gripped me so hard right away was I was already kind of in that mindset for something like that. So yeah, it's been really fun. I love watching people talk about their nostalgia series because I just love watching people light up about books that they love. So I've been kind of enjoying vicariously learning about the series that way. But
I feel like a lot of people that love Wheel of Time, it's because of that nostalgia thing.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people started it like when they were like in high school or whatever.
Yeah.
It was like their first big fantasy series. So like I totally get the nostalgia kind of thing.
Yeah, when I listen to people who read Wheel of Time a long time ago and they talk about how great it is, it sounds like when I talk about Lord of the Rings. So I'm like, I totally understand that. Just Lord of the Rings is well written.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
So
That's so funny.
I'm curious because I think this came up. I was watching one of your videos earlier, Tori, where you were talking about, I think it was the chat that you had with Library of a Viking, where you were talking about Mistborn as a gateway.
Yeah.
Mistborn was the first adult fantasy you read?
Roughly. I think, I can't remember if I read Hammer of God prior to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Empress is the first book. It's been a long time since I read that trilogy. But yeah, Mistborn was either the first or second adult fantasy that I read, and I really I love heists, and I love Lies of Locke Lamora is one of my favorites.
So good.
It's so good. And I
think we're all like, we can all high five each other.
Lies of Locke Lamora.
Lamora is the shit.
Loved it.
Absolutely.
So good.
One of my favorite bromances in fantasy ever.
Yes, it's so good.
Did you guys read? Did you read the second one?
I've read all three.
I've only read the second one up to
the second one is I think the second one's my favorite.
I like
you.
That's the one where Locke and Jean's relationship is just like
so many people
perfection.
And Zamora Drakasha, the female pirate captain, was so awesome. Oh,
she's so good.
Yeah, what a good series. I want to run a D&D campaign based off that series.
Just I won't get into details because spoilers, but once you get into Malazan, Jordan, I want to know how you think Locke and Jean stack up against Ikariam and Mappo.
Okay.
It's a very different bromance. It's
I just
much
love close
sadder,
friendships.
but
you're gonna love that. There's so many in Malazan though. That's one of the things that Erickson perfects is the dynamic duo relationship.
Yeah. Malazan is like, they're all over the place. Callum and Quickban and Ikariam and Mappo, and there are just so many of them all over. And they're such good pairs. But I mean, because it's like a cast of thousands kind of series, you don't get to go into any of them that deeply. Like, he manages a lot with pretty short amount of space, but it's not like where you've got a whole book which is about Locke and Jean. Yeah, it's quite different from that for sure.
I was surprised how many people I've talked to about the series that don't enjoy. Well,
yes, Kevin. I'm absolutely certain.
Locke is like a weak.
Ikariam or Mappo could kill both of them alone, let alone
with one hand.
Yeah, with one hand, half bled to death.
Yeah. That's not the point, though.
That's not the kind of stacking up against them that I was talking about.
They could probably con their way around Mappo and Ikariam, though.
Maybe.
So here's a. Liam is much younger than me, but he's read a lot of the old books that I've read.
Yes, I love Liam's Lyceum.
Do you guys know Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser? D&D has barbarians and thieves in it because of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Like Gary Gygax, back when he designed the game, he actually said that the idea of a thief in the game was based on the Grey Mouser. It's a series written by Fritz Leiber. It's very old school, like sword and sorcery kind of stuff. But a lot of it is urban. It's in a city. Like, I started reading Lies of Locke Lamar and I was like, oh, okay, so this is sort of like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. It's really, really good stuff. And Fafhrd is this very mostly sort of polite and gentle barbarian. And the Grey Mouser is an extremely, extremely dodgy, thievy kind of dude. And they're also a great bromance from fantasy. Cool. And they were in the Deities and Demigods book back in the day in first edition D&D. That was actually something I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned it at some point, Jordan, in one of your videos, that you are running a booktuber D&D game.
Yeah.
Are you you're the DM?
Yeah.
Who's playing?
It's Alex from Tall Guy Reads, Theo from Rekindled Reader, RJ from RJ Reads, Kyle from Read by Kyle, and James from, I don't know what his channel is called, but James McCullough from his he's another booktuber. But yeah, it's going great. Cool. It's so fun. We're just doing like a module because it's only 2 people have actually even played D&D before. Okay. So we're just doing like a easy module to get everyone learning the rules and everything like that. So it's a blast. It's so fun.
I DNF'd D&D recently.
You DNF'd D&D?
I started playing it with my friends and my husband for the first time. I tried to play it when I was a teen several times, and I could never get past just creating a character. It just took a whole night to create a character, and then we'd never play, and that happened so many times. And so I finally got together with a group that were all excited about it, and they were all into it. And I went to about 3 or 4 sessions, and I was just bored out of my mind.
My husband's the same way. He was like, do we have to keep doing this? I was
My
like,
husband's really into it, so I just let them take off with my character, and I'm like, I just don't think it's for me. I don't know why. I don't know why.
I've been in a campaign with a group of friends for like 3 years, and where it's like it's just like so emotionally, like you get so emotionally invested in your characters after a while. Like we've cried playing before. Like it is so good. I mean, I have a whole video on my channel about books that feel like D&D where I talk about how important D&D is. Like my channel would not exist without me playing D&D. So it's just, I could go on for days.
Well, Malazan Book of the Fallen, or the Malazan series, not even just the 10-book series, is created because Ian Esselmont and
yeah, that's what I've heard.
D&D.
Yeah.
They created the entire world for a campaign, and
phenomenal.
The two of them played different characters who were actually in the books. I mean,
Sure.
he has said, both of them have said, like, a lot of the stuff that happens in the books isn't exactly out of their game or anything, but like the basic personalities and a lot of the lore and the world building and stuff like that came originally out of the game and then developed naturally far beyond what was in the game to make the books out of it.
Everyone's getting me so hyped to read Malazan.
I feel like that's
good.
This discussion has just turned into
I'm
a let's
sorry.
fight Gordon for her Malazan.
Let's convince Jordan that she absolutely has to read Malazan.
We get 2 people who are enthusiastic about Malazan together, and the conversation will go there. But now we have 3 in this chat, and then one who's reading it starting the next year. It's like, how can we help ourselves?
We had a whole conversation about it just last night when I've been very apprehensive. I've been very nervous just because it's one of those huge daunting series and I've heard it's really dark, but then everyone last night was like hyping it up so much. I was like, all right, I'm in.
Yeah. But it's also funny. And
that's what Philip was saying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It has a lot. I like what Philip has said before, that Erickson has a wide range as a writer. So he could write these kind of like quirky, soldier banter scenes. And then he can go into these like very beautiful poetic epigraphs, and then these sort of interesting, like philosophical, reflective sort of inner monologues, and then these crazy cinematic battle scenes. And so he could just kind of move around in all these interesting ways. And now she's having to hear it from all 3 of us today.
It's getting me very excited. I am not complaining.
I mean, certainly one of the great things when I first read it, I mean, just as a big Malazan fan, I have to own up. I DNF'd Gardens of the Moon twice before I actually got it, right?
Yeah.
Before I actually got enough into it. And on the one hand, I'm very grateful to the pandemic for that. On the other hand, I'm really grateful to Malazan because the pandemic was a pretty horrible time for a lot of people, and pretty much everything in my life that could go wrong went wrong within a 3 or 4 month period. And then I sat down and said, fuck it, I'm reading Malazan. I've had this book on my shelf. I've gotten 200, 300 pages into it twice, and I never kept going. But I don't know. I've got nothing else to do right now. So I read it, and I got about halfway, 3/4 of the way through. And then I was like, okay, so I'm ordering the other 9 books. And I read all of them in 3 or 4 months,
I don't know
which
how you
was
did that.
which was pretty. Well, I wasn't doing anything else. I lost my job and found myself unexpectedly single in a 2-month period during the pandemic where I couldn't go out and do anything. So I was like, I've got all the time in the world.
Time to read.
Yeah, why not? Why not read the biggest series I've ever read? And it kept me sane. That summer. Why is my doorbell ringing? Who could possibly be ringing my doorbell? Talk amongst yourselves. I'll be right.
Well, I'll just say, so I was saying before, I've told this story before, but I'll just go ahead and say it to you two because I don't think I've ever told you two before. So I read Gardens of the Moon, fell in love with it, picked up Dead House Gates. I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't even know it was a 10-book series. There was like almost nothing on BookTube at that time about Malazan. And when I got into that, I just was not expecting a whole new cast of characters, a whole new continent, all of this new stuff. And it was very different pacing wise, the way that the rise and fall of action happens, the structure of the book. And I just, it took a while for me. It really did. And I'll be honest, and people will hate me for saying this, but I did not connect Mappo and Icarium the House Gates till later in the series. Alan and I agree about that, actually. But anyway, and then what actually made me go back to it, though, is like I said, I couldn't stop thinking about it, though, months later, especially with what happened at the end of that book and the specific character that we were talking about earlier. And then I think the other two driving forces on BookTube that got me convinced I had to pick up Memories of Ice was, one, Books with Brittany did an interview with Steven Erikson. And it is one of my favorite interviews with Steven Erikson to this day. And when he talked about the series, it just, something in me, like a light switch went on. And he said in that particular interview, he said, certainty is not a virtue. And for some reason, I even quoted it in my comment, like, certainty is not a virtue. Oh my goodness. Like, I don't know why, but that for some reason was right away speaking to something inside me. And I feel like you see how that plays a role in the series if you pay attention, because he has a lot to say about what virtue is and questioning that. And he just leads you down a road of questions that are very powerful for just real life. And so after watching that interview, and Andy Smith, who is now getting back online, he took a bit of a break to be a politician, but he has wonderful Malazan content. He was on that video that I know that the video with Matt, the other Matt, about favorite fantasy booktubers or whatever, favorite fantasy book of all time. And so anyway, he also chose The Crippled God on that video, but he did a video about Malazan and kind of like postmodernism and deconstructivism. I always get the title wrong, but he basically explained in that video what Malazan is about and what he's doing with gender roles. And that video I recommend to everyone, and I will send it to you, Jordan, because that was also the icing on the cake for me, just deciding I had to continue with the series, and that it made me realize, and I really love, Tori, that you did that video with Johan, because I think the way I would describe Erikson's approach to fantasy is the complete opposite of what Sanderson is doing.
Yes.
Once I understood that, then I was like, oh, he's doing something different. I don't know why I was so slow to figure that out. But once I understood how he was going about it in a different way, suddenly it was like a light bulb, and I knew I had to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels like I also watched that recently, that chat you had with Johan, and Sanderson to me feels like he's writing about a D&D game.
Yeah.
Like
it feels very D&D.
It feels sort of beat for beat like
Yeah,
the way a D&D game kind of plays out, which is hilarious because Malazan is based on a role-playing game originally, but it doesn't feel like that at all. Like you couldn't play a D&D game that feels like the way reading Malazan feels.
Right.
But you could
Stormlight
totally
feels like
play
a D&D
Stormlight.
campaign.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I've been playing role-playing games since, I don't know, I was 14 or something, on and off, and I still play. I've actually got a game coming up tomorrow, not D&D, but a different game. But the idea of a hard magic system seems to me like something that didn't. I may be totally wrong about this, but it seems to me like something that didn't exist before D&D. Like D&D becoming a big thing and a generation of authors growing up playing D&D is where it feels to me where hard magic systems come from.
That's
because D&D has a hard magic system. It has a set of rules with a description of every detailed thing and exactly how it works. And if you play that for a long time, you think that's how fantasy is. But like before D&D got to be a big thing, I mean, D&D has been around since the early 70s, but before it got to be a big thing, I don't know if there really were hard magic systems in anybody's. Like sword and sorcery, magic is only used by bad guys generally, and it's dark and mysterious and threatening. Like you don't know how it works. Bad guys do it, and it just happens.
So Philip just put the AP's dissertation. That's AP's dissertation topic. I know,
and I've been annoying AP for a while about giving it to me. I told him a number of times I would like to read it.
I'll probably look it up.
Yeah, possibly find it somewhere. I don't know, but
I'll try to look it up.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I'd be really interested.
You know, so Raph did a video about this too, by the way. And also you could see this in video games. When I read Mistborn, that was my first thought. I thought, oh, this is like going through a video game tutorial.
Yeah, Mistborn does feel like a cool video game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, video games come from D&D.
Yeah,
you know, it's all related. Like the way video games work is, it's not that different than D&D worked in the early 80s. You know,
the Witcher video game is also very D&D.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any video game that calls
video
itself a
game.
role-playing game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you haven't played The Witcher 3.
My husband has. My husband played The Witcher 3 while I read the entire Witcher series, and I think he had more fun than I did.
Oh, absolutely. I've also read all the books, and I don't know why I put myself through that.
Yeah.
The game is phenomenal, way better than the books.
Yeah.
The characters are better. It's the game is so good. I also was unemployed during the beginning of the pandemic. I played through The Witcher twice.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot. I love the card game in the middle of the Witcher game.
Gwent.
I never played it.
Gwent,
I skipped all the Gwent quests.
Gwent actually became its own game. They did a spin-off, and there's a full game which is just the card game.
That's cool.
Yeah,
with a lot more
all
cards and collectibles.
I cried at the end of The Witcher. Both times I played it.
I loved the soundtrack to that.
Oh, it's so good. I read to the soundtrack. I'll turn it on.
I was reading the series and he was playing the game, and I was like, "This is so nice." I don't usually read with music, but I did like that.
Yeah, the Witcher books not so good. The game incredible.
I was also like,
yeah.
They feel, I don't know. They remind me of a lot of older, like much older, sort of pulpy fantasy, where there's a story, and the characters are there just to make the story happen.
Yeah,
but there isn't a whole lot of actual character going on. They're just moving pieces around so that the story gets through.
The pacing was weird, and there was like one of the books that I was really enjoying. I don't remember which one. I think it was like the second one after the short stories, and it was really, really working for me. And then the end of it, there was like this one scene that if you've read them, you'll know it was like very graphic and very strange. And the way it was written made it seem like it was totally normal and okay for that to be there. And it just pulled me so far out of the story. And then everyone after that, I was like, it just wasn't for me. I did not like them.
Yeah.
But I absolutely agree. The video game is genius.
It's so good.
It is so good. I mean, it like when I started it, just like when I start a lot of role-playing video games, you think, well, okay, is this just going to be a whole bunch of fetch quests and the garbage that you always get in most role-playing games? And it is. I mean, there is a fair bit of that.
Yeah.
But then even little quests where you thought, oh, this is another just go get me that thing, it turns into an actual story.
Yeah.
You know, it's a fetch quest as a doorway to something interesting, you know, and it surprised me over and over again. I really, I also played through it, I think twice.
The combat is also so good in it.
Yeah.
I get very picky about combat in video games, and I think the combat is so fun in The Witcher.
That's so cool. That's so cool that you played the game and both of you played the game and read the books. That's so neat.
I didn't read all the books, to be honest.
You don't have
I read enough of them to realize I didn't want to read all of the books.
Yeah. I read all of them and I was really disappointed at the end. I was like, what?
Yeah.
This isn't satisfying.
I do the show is doing a good job adapting them and making them more palatable. I've been really enjoying the show. The second season, the last one that just came out, the last like 2 episodes I've watched like 4 times each.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
I only watched the first episode of the second season, but I'm notoriously terrible when it comes to watching adaptations. I do want to get better about that, but I'm just the worst.
Speaking of which, House of the Dragon, Rings of Power, Sandman.
I haven't watched Rings of Power or Sandman, but I am watching House of the Dragon.
I haven't watched any of them.
Rings of Power, I will say, can be difficult. There are a lot more mixed. There are a lot more mixed opinions about it, but you should definitely watch The Sandman, even if you haven't read the comic.
I saw the first episode of Rings of Power. I want to watch House of the Dragon, but I don't have an HBO subscription, so we're gonna wait till it's out. But yeah, I watched the first episode of Rings of Power, and I've had more fun, honestly, listening to all of the discussions about it than actually watching the show. So
yeah, I'll get around to it at some point. I will. Yeah, usually when I watch shows these days, it's usually with my husband, and it kind of has to be what he wants to. I don't know. I'd rather not force him to watch something he doesn't want to watch. So, that makes sense. And then I watch a lot of BookTube on my free time, but when I watch BookTube, I'm not watching BookTube most of the time, which is why actually I did set aside time, Matt, to watch your Lord of the Rings video, because I actually had to see the screen.
You can't listen to that video.
Yeah, because most of the time I'm like running around and doing stuff and cleaning, and I'm never just focused on the screen most of the time when I'm listening to videos. So watching Netflix and watching shows these days, I'm like, I actually have to sit and look at the screen.
I don't watch much TV at all.
I kind of recognized after the first episode of Rings of Power that like I grew up with the original trilogy, and that was my introduction to Lord of the Rings, since I hadn't read it or had it read to me. And that was a hugely formative experience in my fantasy journey. And I think I recognized watching that first episode of Rings of Power, I have such an incredibly high standard for any visual art based on Lord of the Rings that I wasn't ready to separate the new series from the original experience I had with the trilogy. And I don't think that I can enjoy Rings of Power in any way until I can view it as its own thing. So I just kind of put it down because, I mean, the original trilogy to me is some of the best television ever made. And like just the dialogue and the casting and everything was just so fabulous. And so now I'm like, okay, I need to be able to separate these two things before I can give Rings of Power a chance.
That's really interesting to me, because it's the first time I've ever heard anyone say they might have a problem with the Rings of Power because of how it looks. Because it's amazing visually. Like it's really, really good, but it does look very different than a lot of what
not
you've seen
visually,
in
like
the
the
movies.
visuals are beautiful, and that was one of the things that I noticed right away. And I love that they're creating some of these other parts of Middle Earth in different eras. For me, it was more the dialogue was an issue right away, and
it's a bit wooden.
Yeah, and like I'm a characters or bust person, like, and that was one of the things I think that helped me get through Malazan as well as I did that early, was because I can't always put things together in books. People have to explain it to me. Like, I don't have a clue what's going on in Malazan, and that's okay. I love the characters, and I'm just here, and I'm just going to figure out what I can figure out, and anything I missed, other people will tell me.
I'm the exact same way.
So it's fine. Like, and I'm just flowing with it and letting myself attach to different characters, and I'm there for the individual moments more than like the big picture. At
that's
this
how
point.
I was. Yeah.
So
that's how I was throughout my whole experience.
Yeah. So the characters, the way that the characters are being written in the dialogue for me is more what I was put off by in the show. I think the visuals, I think overall are really beautiful and cool that they're diving into some more aspects of Middle Earth. But yeah.
What really made it possible for me to enjoy Rings of Power Like I watched the first 2 episodes and I was like, I don't know. It's the dialogue and everything the writing seems really poor and a lot of things don't seem to make sense and whatever. And then I watched Herr Dr. Professor Chase's discussion with AP about the Rings of Power, and that reframed it. And then I realized the mistake I had made. I had a friend over who doesn't have any streaming services. I had him over, and in one night we watched 2 episodes of House of the Dragon, ate dinner, and then watched 2 episodes of Rings of Power. And those are not series that you should mix at all, because House of the Dragon is George R.R. Martin's ugly, gritty, generally pretty realistic Westeros, and Rings of Power is more like mythology. Not everything does make sense, and it's big, epic, grand gestures and that kind of thing. I mean, to be honest, like Tolkien's dialogue, the original, isn't really super smooth and flowing. Yeah, it was also kind of wooden, and also written in kind of a more of a formal style, like you would have in old sagas or in mythology or something. It's not snappy modern dialogue at all. So in that sense, I think that the show is pretty true to what was going on. Speaking of visuals, this is something I wrote down to maybe bring up, because it was I thought one of the most interesting things I saw on BookTube, and it was a while ago. Johanna, you did a video asking everyone about visualization.
Yes. That was one of my favorite videos I've done.
That totally blew my mind, because up until I saw that, I'd never talked to anyone about it. And I just assumed that people saw clear, colorful pictures in their head, because I do.
Yeah, same.
And I thought that's the way people read. I mean, how could you know what's going on in a book, especially fantasy, if you don't have pictures in your head? But people don't.
No.
Apparently.
I know. Well, that was why I did the video, because I kept talking to people, I kept hearing people say this in videos, say, well, I'm not really somebody who visualizes what I read. I'm like, what? I heard it so many times that I finally had to do a video about it, because it just blew my mind. It blew my mind.
What about you two, Jordan and Tori?
I feel like I'm in the middle. Like, I feel like what I visualize is like kind of like when you're dreaming about something and like everything's kind of blurry, like nothing's super clear. Like, I feel like I definitely don't visualize characters. I know I just kind of see like a headless person, I guess, or like a faceless person. Yeah. But I do feel like I visualize settings, but again, not like detailed settings, more like the vibes of the setting. So I think I kind of visualize blurry.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I feel like I got a lot of comments on that video, and a lot of people said that they don't visualize characters. And when I paid attention, actually somebody, an erudite adventure, Tim, I think is his name, from that channel, he said he's a huge Tolkien buff. And so he's read Lord of the Rings multiple times. And he said that he had a very vivid idea of what Treebeard looked like. And when he watched the movie, it was different. It was different than what he had visualized. And he said that when he went back and reread the trilogy, or when we read Lord of the Rings, he realized that, same here. So he said that when he when he reread Lord of the Rings, he realized Tolkien doesn't really describe the details of how people look. And I thought about it, and I started paying attention, and I've noticed that many times authors very rarely describe visual characteristics to their characters. There might be one or two things, but then even if they do describe it, it's usually at the beginning and we move on. And we're mostly focused on the landscape or the setting, because that's the ever-changing feature. So you don't really have to focus it on what the character looks like as much. Yeah. It's more their personality and emotions and reactions.
I think the first time I noticed that I wasn't picturing people in books was during like the whole Twilight craze. I was like 100% part of that, because it came out like at the perfect time for me to be obsessed. And so me and all my friends were like so excited when they announced the movie and everything. And then they came out with the casting, and I was just like, okay. But everyone was like, that isn't how I pictured them. And I was like, wait, how did I picture them? And then I was like, I don't think I did. Like I realized that I just didn't ever picture people when I was reading.
Oh, yeah, I definitely do. And I know that every time there is an adaptation, I feel like my mind has to kind of do an adjustment. Like, okay, I'm going to warp them to that character in my head. But and I can morph it. Like I have an ability to morph characters in my head, but it's like an adjustment.
I think if I've seen an adaptation and then I read it, I think I picture the adaptation person.
It affects me that way too.
Yeah. I know next time I reread Dune, Paul is going to be Timothée Chalamet.
Yeah.
that is unavoidable. He did such a good job in the movie. He had so much presence as this kid. I can't imagine Paul Atreides as anyone but Timothée Chalamet probably ever again.
Yeah.
So Tori, do you visualize?
You know, it's funny because I don't know that I ever really seriously thought about it until right now.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. I am such an incredibly emotional reader, like not in a sense that I'm like, you know, I was crying about stuff or anything like that, but just the emotional connection that I have to the story and the moments and the characters is what I visualize. So it's more like I can't necessarily, I'm very fluid in the way that I view characters. Like I'm not always mad about if the adaptation looks different. It doesn't necessarily bother me unless it is like one of my top 10 characters. But even then, it's not so much the visual as the presence. A great example of that, like if Red Rising ever becomes an adaptation, which I'm equal parts excited and terrified for, Severo has got to be perfect. He is my favorite character in fantasy ever at this point. And like, he has to be perfect. And it's not so much what he looks like. It's that energy that those characters possess and how they feel and the presence that they have on screen. I think that to me is the more impactful.
Yeah.
I think like Shadow and Bone that recently came out, I had not read any Throne of Glass books. I had only read Six of Crows. And Kaz Brekker was a character that I was very nervous about because he has a very specific energy to him. And I thought they got the casting really well. Like
I did too. I liked it a lot.
So, yeah, I mean, I liked a lot of who they casted for the Six of Crows characters. So I think the visual, like the environment to me is more important for immersive reading. And then the characters, it's more about the emotion and the energy that they have, I think.
Yeah, I asked Mark Lawrence, the one that Philip is pointing to. So what happened was after I posted that video, I'm trying to think of his name. I cannot think of his name now. Shoot. Somebody tweeted my video and then Mark Lawrence responded and they said, I can't even listen to Mark Lawrence's books when I'm driving because it's like a movie in my mind. And then Mark Lawrence said, that's funny because I don't visualize what I'm writing. And then I asked him, I said, well, how do you feel when you see people's fan art of your work? And he said he really appreciates it, that he loves it because he's an amazing writer. Obviously, he writes in such a way that it's a very immersive visual experience for those of us who visualize what we read. But he himself as a writer doesn't even visualize it. And what I learned was there's such a spectrum of experiences. So like what you were talking about, Tori, with your experience of needing Severo to be just right energetically, is the thing is that the visual component of reading is, I think those of us who visualize, we're like, what? How could you enjoy books if you don't visualize? But the thing is, you can connect to books for so many other reasons than being able to visualize it. You can connect to the energy of a character, the emotions they're going through, the empathy experience of what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, the tension, the suspense, or even thinking about the plot and what's happening there. So visualizing what you read is absolutely not a requirement for loving and connecting to a book.
Yeah.
And even the themes, like thinking about the themes that are important to you and even what the story is symbolizing, all of that's not, you don't have to be somebody who visualizes what you read to connect to books for those reasons. And you could even talk in depth about a book without visualizing. I know AP Canavan has said that from A Critical Dragon has said he doesn't visualize what he reads. And he's a critic and an editor, and he's amazing at analyzing story. So it's just interesting to see. I think what was most interesting to me is to see what we do attend to, especially if we aren't visual readers, because there was one comment I pinned on that video, this girl, Stacy, and she explained that she never visualizes what she reads. She has, like, I guess probably the extreme form of aphantasia in that sense, which is what the condition where you don't visualize things. And she doesn't have extreme form, but she has aphantasia in the sense she never visualizes what she reads. Now, you can have aphantasia to the point where you can leave this conversation, and if you tried to picture my face in your mind, you wouldn't remember what I looked like.
Wow.
And you'd see me again, and I'd have to remind you, my name's Johanna. You have that extreme where you can't keep any picture in your head at all. But the people who have like just a mild form of it where they don't visualize what they read, in her case, in Stacy's case, she was explaining that whenever that feeling when you're reading a book and you zone out and then you realize, oh, I didn't pay attention to anything I read. She said every time that happens to her, it's almost always because the author went into a long visual description of the atmosphere or setting. And so she said, as a result, she doesn't connect to some popular books like Night Circus or Strange the Dreamer, or go into a lot of description, because that's not what she attends to as a reader. Right. She's a very plot-driven reader, though. And so she will notice inconsistencies with plot and what's happening with plot. And then there was another video that went out before my video. I just didn't know about this person that Ola from Wild Witch sent me, of a person who has aphantasia. And this person was saying that she also doesn't visualize what she reads at all. And she's a writer. And so when she's reading, to her, she loves very flowery prose, which is not the case for a lot of people, but who don't visualize what they read because the descriptions are lost on them for some of them. But for her, the very, very descriptive prose helps her to connect with the story. So it's weird because it could just totally vary person to person as far as like what is making us appreciate a story. But I think that it's important, because if we're going to talk about books and we're going to talk about why we're connecting to them, we have to keep in mind people don't connect to books the way we do or look at the same things we do for the same reasons. So I learned so much from that video. Yeah.
I'm almost the opposite. I get lost in a book if there are not enough descriptions. Like I want to have a feeling for where are the characters. If they're here and they're going there, what does that movement look like? Like, what are they moving through? How long does it take? This kind of thing. It was one of the problems. I recently read Malice by John Gwynne, and I ended up connecting with it. I ended up getting into the story, and by the end, I was pretty invested. But at the beginning, there were a lot of descriptions of especially of like movement or activities where I was like, I don't understand what's going on. It's like they teleported somewhere or something. It was just a really weird feeling of movement and space and places. And I have super hard time with stuff like that. If there aren't descriptions, I get a little lost. I just like it all seems kind of vague, and I don't understand what's going on and who's doing what and where they are and all of that sort of stuff.
That's interesting. I just read Malice and didn't even notice that. Like they could just say, and we're here, and I'd be like, okay, cool. It's just something I never pick up on, because maybe it was because I was more focused on who all the characters were, because it's very hard to follow at first.
Right, but I have a kind of head cinema going on.
Sure. Yeah.
Right, and I've got shots in my head.
Yep.
And it'd be like, if in a movie they were in a room and then all of a sudden they were on top of a hill, the next cut. Yeah. And you had no feeling of they moved, Yeah. And
that's interesting.
I noticed that in a lot of more modern fantasy books, like the stuff I've read recently. Like I started with Tolkien. First real fantasy or adult fantasy I ever read. And I was rereading Tolkien once. And a friend of mine who'd read it, he looked over and he's like, "So, how's the landscape descriptions going?" Because Tolkien is kind of a third, like landscape descriptions, like Lord of the Rings is anyway.
It's so good, and
they're excellent descriptions, but
yeah.
there's a lot of description. Yeah, it's very descriptive, and I had the film in my head, you know. Yeah. So when I saw Peter Jackson's films, I kept having to remind myself, okay, this is not my head cinema. This is somebody making a film about books I love. So of course I'm happy about it, but it's not my head cinema, and it shouldn't look like I think it should look like. Yeah, it shouldn't look like Alan Lee's illustrations or whatever.
Yeah, and, you know, it's interesting how that affects our perception of pacing too. I'm somebody who, like, if I think a book is slow paced, it's probably really
glacial
for most readers. Because I tend to feel very immersed when I read, and I tend to so I guess that's it's just interesting because, like, with Tolkien's landscapes, I guess I see that people think, I hear so many people, and I have some compassion now after I did that video, because I realized, well, people aren't seeing it maybe the way that I'm seeing it in my head, or they're not able to visualize it at all. Hey there, Josh. And at the same time, I felt like the landscape description served the story. People think it's extraneous. And to me, I'm like, no, like if you look at how the landscapes are, especially in the Fellowship of the Ring and what's happening there, and just they're so beautiful first. And you see how beautiful this world is. And then you contrast that with things that the way that the landscape is described in Return of the King. It's dark. It is like a direct contrast. And you see how that sort of is reflective of the psychology of the characters too. And so
it's also reflective of like the state of good and evil throughout the books. You know, it's like the landscape is telling you things are good or things are horrible, you know?
Yeah. It sets a tone and it sets the stakes, like you said, and it's symbolic. I feel like it's actually adding so many more layers to the story than people realize. Yeah,
and it's also, I mean, one of the things that always strikes me when I read Lord of the Rings is without anyone sitting down and giving you a history lesson, the landscape is a history lesson.
It is.
They're constantly walking past or through ruins that were built by the Númenóreans in the First Age or Second Age, or, you know, I mean, there's a lot of history just standing around in the landscape. And a lot of that is what the landscape descriptions are for. You know, it's not just Tolkien liked nature. I mean, he did, but it's not only that, you know.
Yeah. One of the things that I find kind of interesting, kind of going back to that idea of sort of in the visualization sphere, but when you have books where, you know, people are just sort of moving here or there and having that, it feels almost stream of consciousness sometimes, where there's nothing really to ground you in the book. And as a reader with ADHD, I get very frustrated very quickly if I don't have this, then this, then this, then this to kind of help me process exactly where we are and what we're doing. And that was something that I struggled with also, Matt, in Malice, for the first book especially, but kind of through the series, where there were times when I really had to like stop and put the book down and kind of retrace and figure out, okay, so we did this and then we did this, and now we need, like, now we're back up to where we were reading. And that, I think, to me, more so than the plot or the prose, that kind of stream of consciousness, the transitions between scenes matter a lot to me, because otherwise I get thrown off very easily and then I get very frustrated. My husband has listened to so many rants where I will just put a book down in the middle and be so angry because I don't know what's happening or where we're going. So,
and you like Malazan.
I do. I know. It's the weirdest thing. I've told people this before. I don't, the only way I can articulate why Malazan is my favorite books that I've read in fantasy so far, along with others. It's very different than my other favorites, but it's the character moments, and that's what will do it for me every time. And you know, I didn't know everything that was going on in Gardens of the Moon. I was very confused, and then I went to Dead House Gates, and that's where I really found my footing. And it was the moments where they just completely broke. It was the very intimate moments of these characters that really pulled me through that story and made me not even care, which is I mean, we all know that Erickson's a genius, but that really showed me the kind of writer that he is, that somebody like me who really struggles with that, you know, executive function processing was still in it and was loving the characters and loving the story.
Oh, I could tell though, listening to Erickson talk about his writing, though, he really puts a lot of thought into how long it's going to take for these characters to get from here to here. And it's just mind blowing to me. It's so fascinating, by the way, that idea, because I read this self-published book that I won't call out the author's name, but it was a friend of mine. And this was years before I started a channel. But it was funny because she had me beta read a book, and the whole book, I was like, is this all in one day? There was no mention of the sky darkening or of the time of day. And I didn't realize how much that affected my reading experience until I read that book. And I realized there was so much that happened, but the way it was written, it felt like it all could have just happened in a day. And I don't think that was the intention. I know that wasn't the intention, but yeah, it just needed some time markers or something. And it's weird how little things like that really affect, and maybe that could have even affect our experience in ways we're not even conscious of. But for some reason, I finally tuned into that. I was like, I don't know what day we're on or where, even the time of year, nothing.
Yeah.
I find time a really interesting thing in novels. Like, a lot of fantasy authors, like more modern fantasy authors, they write action really well. It's become a real thing, like, you know, fast paced things happening, action happening. But it's always interesting when an author takes a moment to give us an interior view of a character who's in the middle of some action, because to me the action stops. You know, you can't really do both. You can't have 2 or 3 sword slashes per 10 seconds and someone having a half-page interior thought. You know, I mean, of course you can, because you can summarize our interior thoughts. They may only take half a second. But to me, as a reader, I'm reading boom, 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 and then I'm reading think, and it feels like it's happening in between. It feels like the whole scene is just kind of on pause.
Yes.
And then
I love interior dialogues during battles. That's so interesting.
I'm not saying I don't like it.
I'm
just saying it feels like time kind of stops or slows down dramatically, and then it picks up again when we get out of the character's head and back to the swords. You know.
I love how different everyone reads. It's so interesting.
Oh, I can't wait for you all to get to Bone Hunters Chapter 7.
Fuck me, Bone Hunters Chapter 7. In all of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that is probably the most famous chapter. Bone Hunters Chapter 7 is... My only advice for reading that chapter is don't start it after 8 p.m. Because it's, I think, maybe one of the longest chapters in the entire Malazan Book of the Fallen, and you can't stop. Right? It's one of those chapters you just have to read the whole damn thing.
Yeah.
And I started reading it at 11.
Oh no.
And I was up late. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was up pretty late. Yeah.
I just want to reread the whole series. Maybe I'll drink it along.
Do it.
I have like no time to do that.
I think everyone, I'm not sure, but I think everyone that is doing this read along is also doing your A Song of Ice and Fire read along. So like, I have no idea if I'm gonna get to read anything else next year.
I know.
Josh says it's good to know. Kev says Bone Hunters Chapter 23 is better.
I love the end of Bone Hunters. I don't feel like the end gets talked about enough because of Chapter 7. And I love that's a good book. It's a good book. Of all the books, I think Bone Hunters for me, well, the bone hunters and the crippled god felt pace. I said I'm if I think my internal pacing clock is all off, but I felt like pacing wise, those two felt the fastest for me. Where like I just didn't want to stop kind of thing. I don't know if that was your experience, Matt.
I mean, it sort of points to one of the things that I like most about Erikson's writing is sometimes when I read like Malice I'm not shitting on John Gwynne. It was his debut novel and I ended up really liking it, but there were points in it where I felt like the writing wasn't doing what maybe it was supposed to at that moment.
Sure.
Right? There is nowhere in the Malazan Book of the Fallen where I think Erikson is not writing to achieve exactly the effect he wants. Right? And the effect is sometimes you don't know what's going on. Or you have lots of questions that aren't being answered immediately or whatever. But that's exactly, I think, exactly what he's trying to do to you as the reader by the way he's writing what he's writing. Yeah. And there's just a certain kind of mastery of using the tools that writing gives him as an author to get you as a reader in a certain place, in a certain emotional state, in a certain kind of confusion or whatever. It's all, I mean, my big recommendation, like this is actually from Herr Professor Dr. Chase. He said it and I realized, yeah, that's the best Malazan advice I've ever heard is don't stress about any of it.
But you will.
Just read it. You probably will, but like what I recommend people think of it as a fantasy mystery novel.
Yeah.
Right? And when you go into a mystery novel, you don't expect to understand everything. It's part of the whole idea that you don't know who did it. You don't know what the weapon was and you don't know why. And, and you discover as you go along. And I think in a lot of fantasy, it seems like a lot of authors go way out of their way to make sure you understand everything. And they give you info dumps and they give you the wise older character who explains to a younger ignorant character how everything works so that we as a reader know. And Erikson puts you in a world that is confusing to the people in the world, right? And you don't understand things because they don't understand things. There's magic in the world. People use magic, but hardly anyone really knows how it works.
Yeah.
Except the people that can do it. And even they don't know everything about how it works. So you never have a feeling of understanding more than the characters logically would. Yeah. And I love that, but it does make for confusing sometimes.
That's why I think that I if you've watched any of my videos, you know how much I've been loving the Gideon the Ninth series a lot too.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the things I love so much about that series is like almost nothing is explained to you. And like I've talked about how in the second one, Harrow the Ninth, I never like tab books at all, but I went and like dug some out of a drawer somewhere because you really don't know what's going on until like 70% through the book. And so then like as all the reveals start to happen, I was just like tabbing them left and right because I was like my mind was just blown. And I think that's so fun to like because like the payoff is just so rewarding once you finally kind of understand anything that's going on. It's like such a fun thing because then I've gone back and reread the first two now before the third one came out. And like all of the things you pick up on the second time you read it, knowing where it's going, is just so fun. I love books like that. So I think Malazan is going to work for me. I think in
your review of the ninth books, you said lesbian necromancers in space.
Yeah.
And I thought that sounds like a B quality porn movie.
Sure.
But on the other hand, I've everything I've ever heard about that series, I thought, yeah, it sounds kind of YA-ish and kind of edgelordy and angsty. And it is
angsty. It's not YA. It does not read YA.
It just kind of never really sounded like it was for me. But then you said lesbian necromancers in space, and I was like, that sounds like it could at least be fun.
It's a blast. It's also so funny. Like, it's just like a really funny, like Tamsin Muir's prose is just like hilarious. And it's very touching. But yeah, she's very good at like, not like the start of each of the sequels, so the Harrow of the Ninth and the None of the Ninth, you're in like a completely different place with some different characters, and like you really just don't know what's going on, and it makes it so fun. But then like all of the reveals realize that like it wasn't that Tamsin Muir didn't know what was going on, it's that she was like slowly building up to where she was going to reveal stuff. And like it makes me wonder like what the outlining process is like, because like all of this stuff, the way the breadcrumbs that she leaves throughout all of them are just so well placed and so well like thought out. It blows my mind. I can see why this series would not be for everyone, because it is very confusing. But I think Harrow of the Ninth, the second one, is one of the best books I've ever read. Like probably top 10 at least.
Okay. I mean, I'm a huge Malazan fan, so obviously I don't mind confusing.
It's very confusing.
Yeah, I have no problem with confusing as long as it's confusing because the author is writing it to be confusing, and not because the author's writing poorly.
Yes.
I think one of the main things, like if I look at a cover that has a slim, sexy-looking person in skull makeup, I'm like, yeah, it looks very edgelordy to me. It feels like it's probably for the teenager I used to be.
Sure.
And not so much the old guy I am now, but I don't know. You've definitely done a very good job of recommending it, so it might be worth having.
At least give it a shot.
I just want to add in though, based on what Philip has recommended, I love Philip's advice, and of course he's very wise and very knowledgeable, and he's added to my experience reading the series quite a bit. I've had fantastic discussions with him on the series. I would say the advice of going with the flow, though, I tried. That was not very easy for me to do as a first-time reader, despite even hearing over and over and over again, go with the flow. And I know some people can do it. It depends on the person. So every one of us is different in that. But I think what worked for me the best was kind of thinking of it almost like going to another country, country where you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know anything, you don't know the people, they're speaking another language, all that happening. And so what you do is you just, exactly what Tori said earlier, you just accept that you're not going to like know the whole language and know everything overnight, or have somebody translate everything for you. But you more like, okay, this is what I do know, and I'm going to go with what I do know and appreciate what I can appreciate. That's maybe different than what I known before. So that's kind of the approach I would take from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other thing, which I didn't have the first time I read it, but all of you definitely have, is find a Malazan buddy who already has read it. Because Malazan fans, I don't know what all the other fandoms for big series are like, but Malazan fans, I've found to be, first of all, extremely spoiler conscious.
Yes.
And super, super in love with watching someone read it for the first time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the best, somebody just said this in a video I watched recently. I can't remember who it was, but they said that they had somebody that they could ask, should I understand this?
Yep.
It was Johanna.
Johann said it when he was talking to you. That's right, Tori.
Yep.
And that is the best question with Malazan. It's just,
should I know this right now?
Exactly. Did I miss something? Or is this just not clear actually in the narrative yet? And should I just relax and I'll get it eventually? I mean, that's a lot of the thing also, is maybe just to have a lot of trust in Erikson as a very good author. He's not fucking with you and he's not forgetting anything.
No, yes.
Right? He hasn't left anything out accidentally. He is misleading you sometimes consciously. He is leaving things out very consciously, and they might not come up for another 3 books, but the payoff is there for sure.
And go ahead. I was very nervous about Malazan as a whole, just because I prefer to go into books very like empty-headed. Like I don't want to analyze books when I'm reading, because I'm reading to enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And I was really nervous that I was going to need to go into it analytically. But Philip Chase was able to like assuage my fears. He was like, don't worry, like you do not have to do that. Just go with the flow if you want, and it will still make sense later. So because I try, like I'm never the person that's like coming up with how I think things are gonna end, or like trying to think too far ahead, because I love surprises and I love the payoff of an author surprising me. So I'm like never thinking next steps. Like I'm just like, I'm here, I'm in this space, and I'm just gonna go with where the author takes me. So I was very nervous that I was going to not enjoy or not understand Malazan because I wouldn't be thinking hard enough. But I've heard that I don't have to think that way.
Thinking too hard, I think, can actually be a problem. Right.
Sure.
It can
Yeah,
get in your way.
If you're expecting it, I think that I love the video of comparing Sanderson to Erikson, because if you go into this series and you've read a lot of Sanderson and you think this is what fantasy is, whoa, even Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's so different than that. He takes a very different approach. And so one thing, I love what you said, Matt, about how he's not messing with you. He's doing things very on purpose, and he's not trying to mislead readers. I mean, if he does, it's even has a purpose. Everything has a purpose. Yeah. And I can say that I haven't reread the series yet, but I did reread the prologue. And even just rereading the prologue, I was like, of Gardens of the Moon, I was blown away, because suddenly it was like, it's like,
oh my God, I get this.
I get it. I get it. I was like, oh my goodness, it's like learning a language that you never thought you would understand. And then going back, I'm like, I actually understand this. It was the most mind-blowing thing for me. But the other thing that also I think really helped ground me when I couldn't make sense of a lot of things, and I'll be honest, there are some things that I probably still don't understand in that series. But at the same time, I think what also helped me ground me, and I think I took this from that video by Andy Smith, the one I'm recommending. I will go ahead and look it up and send it to you all. But he talked about thinking of Malazan even less, even though we talked about how good the characters are, thinking of it less as a character-driven series, less as a plot-driven series, even though there is a good plot. But to think of it more as a theme-driven series. And when you think of it more as a theme-driven series, that was what suddenly clicked for me, because then I wasn't really trying to focus on figuring out a plot or trying to memorize characters. It was more like, with the characters I was able to ground myself with, what are they experiencing? What are the challenges and traumas and tribulations they're going through? And that usually is a key or clue to what the theme is.
Yep.
So that is what I would recommend, is like, what are the difficulties that people are going through, and how does that reflect back to theme? And then you start to see how what this character is going through over here is sort of kind of a mirror or echo to what this character over here is going through. Or, you start to see how he's presenting theme in sort of a prismatic way.
Yep.
Giving you different sort of perspectives on things, and not even answering the question or how you should think about things, but kind of letting you sit with questions, which is what I love.
That's actually one of my biggest favorite things about the series. There are a lot of issues brought up, and very often extremely difficult issues and extremely unpleasant issues, and things that in the moment you don't enjoy reading about. Yeah, there are some ugly things going on, but then also maybe larger, less personal things like environmental concerns or capitalism and its effects and that kind of thing. At no point did I feel like I was being preached at about those issues. Like, never. It's just like him going, here's the thing, and here's some okay stuff that comes out of it, and here's some ugly stuff that comes out of it. What do you think about that? Yeah,
that's something I had brought up in our chat yesterday with Philip, because we were all asking him different questions. And one of the things I asked him was like, because I've heard that there's a lot of really dark content that can be like tough to read in the series. And I was like, does it all feel like earned? Like, is it just there for the shock value? And he made it very clear it is not. But that's always something I'm really nervous about, because like I feel like sometimes George R.R. Martin does that, where he just like has something happen that just feels like it's there for shock value. Again, I do not hate Game of Thrones. It's just not on my top. But I feel like a lot of it is done for shock value. Like there's a lot of really graphic scenes and I'm like, we could have alluded to this without having the graphic nature. But I have also read other stories where sometimes that graphic nature adds to the story. So that was another thing I was very nervous about going into this series. Another thing Philip said will be okay.
Yeah.
So thank you, Philip.
Just already in the second book, they're like a lot of the really unpleasant things that happen in the second book. If they weren't there, the second book wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right? I mean, the whole story would fall apart. They're not there. None of those things are, I mean, it's also such a weird feeling. Like I'm not super squeamish at all, but occasionally there's something like House of the Dragon has had a couple of scenes where I was like, I don't really want to see that up close. And there are places in Malazan where it's the same thing, but if you look away, you're not reading anymore.
Yeah.
So you like you have to do it to yourself.
Brain block. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean you're only doing it to yourself. You can stop anytime you want, but you have to read it. But you don't want to see it. You know.
Yeah. For me, it's less like
especially having a very visual reading mind.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh,
yeah, that must be tough.
Damn, that's ugly, especially in the later books.
Yes.
And Johanna knows what I'm talking about. I mean, there's especially I forget exactly which book it is, but like ninth book. There's this one particular, and I'm just like,
It's hard. I mean, there's
it's really hard, but it belongs in the story. It totally belongs. It is not just trying to.
Doesn't belong, but yeah, I agree.
I mean, I think it like it is demonstrating. It's demonstrating qualities of a culture and qualities of some particular people, and those are important.
I agree.
You know, to the story. He probably could have written around it, like, you know, it didn't necessarily absolutely have to be there, but it's also not gratuitous.
Right.
Yes. Well, it is very triggering to the point where I know a couple of people are not okay with it. They're just straight up not. And they're still Malazan fans, and they're just like, no, heck no.
I totally understand that.
Yeah,
I totally understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's some ugly, ugly stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
So be warned. I would look up trigger warnings before reading the series, especially for book 9. I think that I mean, I have a friend that I let her know, and actually I was warned too about this particular scene, and I got her permission to go ahead and spoil the scene for her. And she was very grateful, and may even possibly might. I mean, I guess it's her decision when she gets there. She may make a decision to skip that chapter, and you can skip that chapter. But but I do agree with everything you said, Matt. I do think for me, it served a purpose, and I thought it was handled in a sensitive way personally. But I know everybody has a certain limit as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, there was. I recently had a discussion with some other booktubers about the Live Ship Traders trilogy, the second Robin Hobb series, and the Realm of the Underlings. And there's a very graphic scene in the end of towards the end of that series that when I first read it, I was like, this really didn't need to be here. It just felt too graphic for what I thought she was trying to get across. But then after having that conversation, everyone was able, because we were talking with some other people that have read the whole Realm of the Elderlings. This was on Alex's channel, Tall Guy Reads. And they kind of helped me see why she included it and how it actually did help the story. So that's another reason I'm very excited to be reading Malazan with like others, because for those moments where I'm like, what is going on? Why do we need this? I can have other people to kind of like bounce those problems off of, and maybe find a way to more accept some of those darker things that happen.
Yeah.
I'm curious. What you just said also makes me sort of another question kind of curious, since you're all women and have a female perspective I don't have. Do you feel better about reading things like that from someone like Robin Hobb, who's a woman, rather than from a male author? Is that in your thinking at all?
Actually, with I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to.
No, go for it.
Go for it. Yeah.
I actually really well. I think the way that I would answer that is I really appreciate it when male authors explore difficult topics with females, and with Malazan, he does. He really explores some topics where I could not. We talked about this in our female perspective video, where we could not believe this is a male author writing from the female perspective, because it felt so authentic. And I would say that I don't know how Erickson went about that. I know his father was a psychologist, from what I heard him say, but I do think that if you're an author and you're going to go into those topics, whether they deal with feminine topics like femininity, gender topics, gender norms, or sexuality or racism, even, I think it's very worthwhile to have some sensitivity readers, though.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I find that for me, I'm okay with whoever writes it as long as it is very obviously shown that it is bad, like in some way. Like I find that a lot of times authors will put things like sexual assault or something in a book and it's kind of written off, which is one of my big problems I was talking about earlier with The Witcher. There was a scene that I just felt like it was very graphic, it was very gross, and then it was like very much so accepted by all the characters, and it felt like the whole world felt like it was acceptable, and it was just really kind of disappointing. And so for me, it's less about who's writing it, as long as it's written well and believably. And I agree about sensitivity readers. Like, I know Brandon Sanderson has like a bajillion sensitivity readers because he deals with a lot of like mental health issues in his books. And he's always very conscious of like making sure that he's portraying them accurately. And I think that's really important, even for authors not as big as Brandon Sanderson, who has a full squad of people behind him. But I think it's very important.
Yeah. I don't know. I think for me, at least, to me, again, it doesn't really matter like who it's coming from. It's more how it's portrayed, just like you guys said. And I think, you know, in a nutshell, one of the reasons why the character arc that hit me as hard as it did with Dead House Gates was because I read it during a time of my life where I was kind of unsuppressing some very strong trauma.
Sure.
And I felt like I don't know how to describe this. I kind of death gripped Felizan's character a little bit, and just it really like was kind of a healing journey almost reading her character. And I think that's one of the reasons why it impacted me so much. But yeah, I agree. I think Sanderson is another author, like you said, that, you know, he really does not shy away from mental health topics that other writers sometimes do shy away from because they're harder to talk about, and specific disorders that are harder to talk about. I've talked ad nauseum in my vlogs, especially in the Oathbringer vlog on my channel, about his portrayal of one of the characters that has a very specific disorder later on that he originally wasn't planning for her to have.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
So it's interesting because I think I appreciate that a lot of the authors that are choosing to get into these topics and to really be thoughtful about how they're portraying them in their books, and that they are trying to be authentic with the portrayals of these different themes. It's encouraging more of a discussion around a lot of it, and I think that's incredibly important. And that's something that books, honestly, that's one of their purposes. That's not their only one, obviously, but outside of the entertainment value, it's stuff like this, like we're doing right now, having these discussions about books and how they impact us all differently, and how different characters or themes relate to us as people and might challenge us or feel relatable. So yeah, in a nutshell, it doesn't matter to me who's writing it as much as how they're writing it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I thought was really interesting with Erickson in a lot of those cases. Specifically, I'm thinking about Stoney. Things happen to a character, and the thing happening is actually relatively irrelevant. Like at that moment, it's not described in a lot of detail. There's not a big scene around it, but he deals a lot with what it then means later.
Yes.
You know, what's the effect on that character? How do they deal with it? How do they suffer? How do they maybe get out of it or get over it or move on, or, you know, that kind of thing, but not so much focused on the thing that happened itself, much more on the character and what it did to them. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because I think with that specific character, you're talking about what happened in Memories of Ice. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've heard, I could be wrong about this, but I think I've heard him say he would have approached that a little bit differently. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that's another thing to keep in mind too, is that it's always to keep in mind that I think all of us are on a path of trying to evolve our thoughts and understanding of these topics. And even those of us, who are representative of people of color or of any sort of type of sexuality or gender or whatever, even we are going to get it wrong sometimes, you know, whether we're talking on a video or writing a book or whatever, or reviewing. And so just understanding authors, they're not going to be perfect too. And so I always try to be open to that too, that they are on a journey learning as well. That's something I really appreciate about Jenny Wirtz, by the way, who's awesome. And she talked about that in a couple of videos I've seen with her, where she said that, you know, she does approach certain topics that are heavy hitting, like PTSD and racism and things like that in her books. And she has said that there will be people who will tell her she approached that wrong, and she will listen.
Yeah.
She said, okay, I will learn from this. And I'm like, you know, that's amazing. That's like, you know, because it's got to be so uncomfortable to publish a book and knowing, you know, 10 years from now, we're going to all think differently about some of these topics than we do now.
Yeah.
So just understanding that and having some space, I think, for some, you know, I'm not going to judge Tolkien for not fleshing out, you know, Galadriel and Arwen more. Later, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So I think, you know, and there are some things that we could be critical of in Tolkien's work for sure. But I think understanding context, time, and place, I do allow room for that when I read books.
I imagine, like, if I don't really write, but if I imagine I was going to start writing a novel today, I think going anywhere near any of these kind of difficult topics would probably paralyze me.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
you can get these things so wrong so easily, you know, and I think if I was going to write a fantasy novel, it would be light and cheerful, probably.
Legends and lattes.
Just to stay away from all of that
cozy
stuff,
fantasy.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I was actually curious because you mentioned it a couple of times. How's your writing going, Tori?
Good, actually. Yeah, I'm very grateful for just honestly the booktube and book community at large, because everybody's been incredibly supportive and welcoming. And I won't lie, like, stepping into epic fantasy as a writer is very different in my mind than stepping in as a reader, because like you said, you know, I don't shy away from heavy themes in reading or writing. And so, yeah, I'm trying to be very thoughtful in how I'm portraying things, even if I have experienced it myself, trying to portray it in a way that's accessible to people that also have had a different experience, or people that haven't, and this might be something new that they're thinking about or experiencing in a book. But it's going well. I'm at about 40,000 words since August-ish, whenever I started. But yeah, this book has been in the works for this trilogy. The World has been in the works since about a decade ago.
That's awesome.
So I'm very excited. And the trilogy that I'm writing right now didn't even exist until about 8 months ago, because originally the series that it's leading up to was the main thing, and then I realized there was a backstory I needed to tell before that. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm getting to play with a lot of my favorite story elements and character types, and it's just been a blast. I love it.
Do you have a plan for how you'd like to get it out there? Are you planning on going with self-pub or?
Yeah, I have self-published before, a long time ago, and my last one came out in 2020. It's a YA supernatural urban fantasy that explores mental health themes and also werewolves. So yeah, this will be my first epic fantasy. I'm very excited about it, but I am definitely planning on self-pubbing. And partially because, and I think a lot of self-pub authors would say the same thing, I like having the control over what I'm putting in my book and how it's, you know, presented, marketed, etc. So, and it doesn't scare me to self-pub. So, and I mean, the community on Twitter and BookTube and the Discord servers is just incredibly supportive and helpful. So I'm very grateful to everybody that's been kind of taking me under their wing and getting me over the imposter syndrome, because that was a big hurdle. So
Yeah, and I also imagine self-pub sort of saves you from the soul-crushing part of being a big publishing house published author.
yeah,
Like
to some degree, yeah.
It sounds like, I mean, it's actually kind of funny. Like Gareth Hanrahan is a guy I read his Black Iron Legacy, the 3 books that are out. I interviewed him and I asked him, you know, the typical author question, how'd you get published? And how soul crushing was it? And he was like, yeah, I'm almost ashamed because I met a guy and he became my agent and he sent my book out and it got published. Like there was no crushing of souls happening in his process at all. I mean, he's been a role-playing game author for 20 years or something, I think.
Yep.
But maybe it was like he knew some people and there were connections. Yeah. I'm not sure. But yeah, that does happen, but it seems to be rare. In the trad publishing world, it seems to be the exception rather than the rule.
When did you publish the book?
When?
Yeah. Isn't it like
I think the first one was 2018.
2018.
I think, and the third one was last year. And actually, it was just announced today. He's got a new one, which is actually a new series, totally new series, unrelated, different worlds, different characters, everything, and that's coming out in May next year. Wow. And I just wrote his publisher today to get an arc, hopefully.
Nice.
So yeah, it looks like it'll be interesting. We talked a bit about it in the interview, and he said, yeah, it's much more the typical epic fantasy. Like the Black Iron Legacy is very much steampunkish and weird magic and urban. It's all in a city pretty much. And this other one is much more of like a group of heroes going and doing something. I don't know the details really at all, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I realize we've been doing this for 2 hours and it's awesome. I've really been enjoying it, but maybe we want to wind down?
Sure.
I would, again, since we've been talking about it so much in a way, I would ask you a last question. Who's your favorite female fantasy author and female character?
Ooh. I know my author. My author's Robin Hobb. Character, though, give me a moment.
No,
I would also say Robin Hobb for the author part. Only because I haven't read any Jenny Wirtz yet. Everybody seems so in love with Jenny
I'm a little
Wirtz.
torn because of that, because I read both for the first time this year. So I read Farseer Trilogy, and then I read To Ride Hell's Chasm and the first book, Curse of the Mystery. Very different writing styles, though.
I don't think I would have said Robin Hobb just based off the Farseer.
Yeah.
I wasn't fully sold to Live Ship, so.
Live Ship is hot. Yeah, live ship is so good. I keep talking to people about books lately, and like I said earlier, I feel like next year is probably going to be just like, okay, screw it, I'm not reading anything new. I'm just going to do rereads. I'm going to reread the entire Realm of the Elderlings. I'm going to continue my Malazan reread. We've got A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a reread for me. I think next year is just going to be rereads because there's so much good stuff that I've already read that I would love.
Scrolling through my
I know, I'm like,
don't feel put on the spot.
I know.
I
I'm
feel
trying
like
to think of it.
I feel like currently, I feel like my favorite character changes because I'll go through like hyperfixations. So my current favorite character is probably not very surprising, but it's probably Harrow Nona Gesimus from Harrow the Ninth. But again, that's just because it's at the front of my mind because I've been thinking about that series so much.
We're not gonna come back at you like in 6 months and say you were wrong or anything. Mood favorites is totally fine.
My current favorite would be Harrow.
I mean, I'm probably gonna have to. One of my goals this year is actually to read more female fantasy authors, and I have a few that I know I'm going after I have read the books would be up on this list. I'm gonna have to give it to Hob at this point. And I have only read the Farseer trilogy, and I made a misstep, and I actually started the last trilogy, just the first book, because I had no idea. I know, which I still loved because
Tori.
I know. I'm just going to show myself out in shame.
It's a good thing you love Malazan.
But yeah, her writing style is something that I don't think I would normally attach to, but her character work is just so incredible, and the relationships are so good. Fitz and the Fool as a friendship I love, and there are several other relationships in that original trilogy that I really loved. So probably Hob at this point.
Oh, you'll love live ships if you like.
I'm excited about that one. Yeah,
some of the best characters in fantasy and live ships.
I don't know. Female characters. I have several.
I think another one of mine might be Shay from Greenbone Saga.
Which I have not read yet. I need to. I'm very excited about that one. Yeah. I know Fonda Lee is going to be up there.
Stack as well. Yeah.
I think one character recently that I read that I really enjoyed, and the book, my husband's reading it right now, so I don't have it on me, but Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. There's a female character in that story, Itami Cho, that I loved. She's a sword master, and she's excellent. I really liked her a lot.
Wow.
I don't also Volca from the Sun Eater series. I'm reading that right now, and I'm really liking Volca.
Yeah. Oh, so we're counting sci-fi? Isn't that sci-fi?
Oh yeah, that is sci-fi. It's sci-fantasy.
That's okay. Let's say SFF.
From Wicked Good Books did his own warband tag sci-fi called the Firearm Tag, I think. And his tag video made me realize I am missing out not reading more sci-fi because he had so many female characters that were all awesome.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, there's probably a lot of really good female characters out there that I think
you'd like Sun Eater. It reads very fantasy with a lot of it's in space, so it's got a lot of
I have it on my immediate TBR over here. I also gonna shout out Mustang and Victra from Red Rising. I love them. They're also some great female characters.
I did read Red Rising, and I don't know. I just didn't really connect with it.
Did you read the whole trilogy or just the first book?
I read the trilogy and the Iron Gold, and I mean, they were okay.
I
don't know.
Yeah, I read the first one and then DNF'd the second one, but I think it's because I was listening to the audiobooks, and I just think the narrator wasn't working for me. So I want to try again physically.
I think, I might try again with the trilogy someday. I think I had the wrong expectation and mindset. And part of the problem for me was I read Golden Sun right after reading the Fellowship of the Ring, my reread of the Fellowship of the Ring. And talk about pacing. You go from one of the slowest paced books, or famously slowest paced books in fantasy, to the fastest sci-fi space opera it was
Yep.
jarring for me. It was jarring. I couldn't handle it was just too
It
much.
is very fast paced.
Yeah, I did love Morning Star though until the end. I didn't like the end of that book, but I loved Morning Star up until the end.
So
So
it
as far
sounds
as
like you're dodging the question so far.
I know. Because I was going to say, if we're including sci-fi, I do, even though I think the Dune characters are considered flat characters, I know by some standards or modern day standards, I did love Jessica's character, or what I've read of Jessica's character so far in the Dune Chronicles. And I just find her fascinating. And then the other character, with Malazan, there are like at least five that immediately come to mind. And one of them I don't want to mention because I don't want to people think I'm crazy until they finish the series, and then I'll tell you what it is. I want to keep that. I'll tell you later, Matt. But the one that I feel like I can honestly say very easily is Sarah Pedic. And she doesn't really come into the series until book 5. Actually, book 5 introduces a ton of my favorite characters, believe it or not. So that's
Absolutely.
crazy. Yeah. So, but
Sarah
Pedic is one of the most nuanced characters I've ever read about in fantasy, to the point where it almost hit too close to home. Even though I haven't gone through what that character goes through in that series, there was so much there. There was so much there that I found fascinating about that character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'd throw Tattersail up on my list too, because she's just awesome.
She is awesome.
But again, I haven't read the whole series yet, so that may change.
You know, it's interesting. I feel like I said, a lot of my favorite characters were introduced in book 5. Yeah, Picker and Blend are great though too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
but Sarah Pedic is legendary. Yeah, she's definitely up there. I mean, maybe it's just recency bias. I would say my current mood favorite female character is Lysande Pryor, who is the POV character and main character of the counselor.
I gotta read this book.
I know.
It's a good book. It's
so
a really
hard.
good book. I mean, I have a review coming out soon where I explain a lot of this a bit more in detail, but it's the author it's a female author, and she's a poet. She is an award-winning poet in Australia. And it's not flowery prose, but it is quite poetic in a lot of places.
I love that.
Deals with a lot of sexual themes, much more than a lot of fantasy. It's not that it's raunchy and there's lots of sex scenes. I think there's 3 in the book, and they're almost completely interior monologue. It's not about the physical action that's happening or anything.
How did I not think of Arya Stark?
Arya Stark.
And Brienne, yeah.
Sorry. And then Brienne. Oh, then A Song of Ice. I didn't.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, Matt. I'm sorry.
Oh, Jimmy Nuts is here, and he's excited that there's something sexual in a book. Yeah, no, it's really interesting because it's another thing, sort of like Malazan, like Erickson's work, where the world is basically default bisexual in the counselor. It's like everybody just sleeps with whoever they want to sleep with, and some people are only into women. I'm not putting that up on the screen. Sorry. Especially since we're talking about a female character. But it's but she's also really interesting in that she is basically just a scholar who is elevated to become the person who chooses the next ruler. And there's a lot of like dealing with leadership and having confidence in yourself and, you know, learning what you're capable of. There's a lot of those sorts of themes with her, but also a hell of a lot of her interior desires and you know, she's attracted to this man and she's sleeping with that woman, and you know, there's lots of that sort of stuff going on as well. It's a good book. It's definitely a good book.
The Counselor.
The Counselor.
I need to read this book. If anybody wants to
same.
This one.
like have no room in my TBR, but I'm like, if anybody wants to buddy read The Counselor with me,
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yes, Jimmy, E.J. Beaton. I'm doing a Australian authors only Oztober, and E.J. Beaton is Australian. Sam Hawke, who I'm reading currently, City of Lies, also really interesting. The main characters in this are a brother and sister, and he basically suffers from constant anxiety, and the way he deals with it is he's OCD. So he has to do all of these very specific kind of rituals to deal with what's going on in his head. And yeah, I missed the boat for Aussie August. And also you can't make a snappy one word. You can't say August or Oztober rolls off the tongue pretty well. So I'm going with that. But yeah, City of Lies, you've got this boy or young man, 17, I think, and he's super smart, super anxious about everything and has to do all of these strange little rituals. Like he paces a certain number of steps back and forth constantly and that kind of thing. And his sister is, I'm not sure exactly what you would call it, but she's got some sort of physical weakness. She is very unable to do a lot of physical things, and they are the poison testers for the ruler.
Wow.
Or he
that sounds
is.
dope.
Yeah, and then it's like it's interesting because it switches POV every chapter. It's him and then it's her and then it's him and then it's her, and it's just constantly back and forth. So sometimes you get them in the same scene, and you get like his view of what's going on, her view of what's going on, and they have very different personalities. It's really, really good. But yeah, as far as favorite female character, I'd say it's Lysand from The Counselor. At least at the moment, just like Jordan, it'll probably change next month when I get into, what's the next one? House of Chains in Malazan.
I love House of Chains. And by the way, Matt, it sounds like you need to do a Hidden Gems video, just like Josh did here in the chat.
Like books that aren't being talked about that much. I mean, that is kind of one of the main things I want to do. I mean, that's why I jumped on Gareth Hanrahan's books, because I had heard they were really good. I already knew his writing from role-playing games. Like I've played games that he wrote. And I knew, and I know people in the role-playing industry, and they are friends with him, you know, so I kept hearing about him. And then when I saw he wrote a novel and almost nobody was talking about it on BookTube, I thought, okay, I'm going to read those and review them.
I don't know if this would be for you or not, Matt, but right now I'm rereading Brahms' The Child Thief. Do you know of Brahm, the artist?
Yeah.
He did the art to a lot of fantasy covers, including
No, I know his work. He does beautiful work.
Yeah. I'm rereading it's actually one of the darkest books I've ever read, if you can believe that. And it's called The Child Thief, and it's a dark Peter Pan retelling. And
that's right. Yeah, you mentioned that in the video.
It's disturbing in some ways. Man, the captain, by the way, you know, the captain in Peter Pan, the captain character in this retelling of Peter Pan is just phenomenal. I just love that character. So it is such a cool subversion of that character. And it actually ties in like Arthurian lore into this Peter Pan retelling. So instead of like Never Neverland, there's Avalon. And so there's like the Lady of the Lake, and it's good though. It's really weird. And the art is by Brahm. There's art in there that's actually drawn by Brahm. And I know you love art. So might be something to check out. I don't know if it would be for you or not, but it's interesting. It's weird.
Jimmy asked me, but also for all of us, Sarah J. Maas.
Oh no.
I have.
I have not. I don't.
I was back in my YA days. I was a huge Sarah J. Maas fan, like early 20s. And I actually I met her once at one of her book tours. And then as I got older and learned more about the world, I learned how problematic some of her themes are that she uses, and
I know nothing. I've heard the name, but I know nothing otherwise.
The Throne of Glass books and the
Court of Thorns and Roses.
I've read all of her books.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I as I've gotten older and matured and just learned more about the world in general, I'm like, wow, because it's got a lot of those toxic relationship traits that you were talking about, Tori. It's got a lot of that. It's that as a young adult I was eating up because, again, Twilight phase. So it was just like, I was like, yes, this is so romantic. I love it. And then I got older and I was like, those are abusive relationships.
I would say the thing that healed me after reading A Court of Thorns and Roses was watching Alan from Library of Alexandria's vlogs. That was like the best part of having read those books was watching his vlogs.
That was so good. So good.
So it sounds like maybe I don't need to read that.
No, you do not need to read it.
I read A Court of Thorns and Roses via audio, and then I physically read her book Crescent City, or the first book in that series.
Yeah.
I could not. I was really bored through A Court of Thorns and Roses. I was just shocked how bored I was.
Yeah.
Just like Alan's vlog, he will tell you how boring it is.
Yeah.
And then with the Crescent City book, it just felt so convoluted. It's like, let's build a world with werewolves and fairies and every single paranormal creature you can find, and angels and demons, but it was so convoluted and it was a mess. And it just, I couldn't get into it. I read it though. I did finish it, but
the second one is worse.
I've heard.
I have a full rant review. It's like one of my first YouTube videos. It was so bad.
I've been very entertained watching the spoiler-filled rants about that book, though.
Yeah. It was bad.
And I'm not a ranter. I'm not here to like be a ranter or anything, but I can't help it.
I try not to. But
I try not to too, but that one, I have a rant. That's the only rant review on my channel is for ACOTAR, because I was like, I can't even with this book.
Yeah, I feel bad, but because I don't want to bring any shame though. If people love Sarah J. Maas, more power to you.
Several of my friends who read more on the YA fantasy side of things, that's like one of their favorite trilogies. And I'm like, you know what? You do you. That's awesome.
Reading is subjective.
Not my thing.
Read what you enjoy.
Exactly. I will say really quickly, if I can, Johanna and Matt and Jordan too, if you end up liking Malazan. So I'm currently reading A Touch of Light by Tiago Abdallah. And there's been a couple moments in here where I'm like, that has a very similar, like what I loved about Malazan. There's flavors of that in here. So I'm about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through it. And I'm going to highly recommend that one for you guys if you're looking for something that, you know, it's definitely like Malazan is this like giant scope thing. This one is like, you know, 3 POVs, but there's some of the writing style or character work too. I've been like, oh, that's something that sounds like something I liked about Erickson was kind of coming through in that too. So
I've heard about this. I've seen people talking about him.
Yeah. The title and the author's name are going around a fair bit.
He's a great guy.
Tiago, right? Tiago Abdallah. And I do have the ebook and audiobook. He gifted me the audiobook too. And it is on my TBR. Yeah. And actually, I was almost going to pick it up this month. And then I remembered another read along I'm committed to and Jimmy will be happy to hear this. I'm going to be reading the Baker series, starting the Baker series, The Darkness That Comes Before. So I'm going to be starting that next. And Kevin, I know Kevin's a huge fan of that series too, if they're both still in the chat.
I've also got the first book in my TBR stack, but I'm just I don't need another heavy series while I'm doing a Malazan reread.
No, I that's why I waited. I wanted to make sure I was a little more cleared on my series, but I am going to read that. And I got excited when I saw you on Twitter posting about it. I thought, oh, I want to read that.
It's good. I'm enjoying it. And two of the POVs are female, and I'm really enjoying both of them so far. So
nice. Perfect. Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for the recommendations anytime.
Yeah.
I'm curious. It's kind of a different subject, but it's been on my mind a lot lately because I am currently listening to an audiobook more or less for the first time ever. I think I tried an audiobook like 20 years ago and was like, I'm just not, it's not going in somehow. And I'm listening to Peter McLean's Priest Bones.
Oh yeah, I just finished that.
It's really cool on the audiobook.
Nice.
Like, I'm getting to the point, like, for me, the way I think about it is if I'm listening to an audiobook, that's time I could be reading. Right? So I'm starting to do audiobooks because I'm starting a new job soon and I'm going to have a longer commute than I wish I had. So I'm going to have like an hour and a half every day where I'm just in a train and changing trains and, you know, running up and down stairs and train stations and stuff. So I started listening to it, and maybe it sort of goes back to our topic earlier of visualization and getting like involved. I've been walking into shit.
That's great.
Like and having a hard time dealing with the world because John Lee is the narrator and he is amazing. He's really, really good. And the way he does the voices, I get so into it. I've missed my stop on the train, and then I get off and I don't know where I'm going and I have to pause the damn thing so I can deal with the world again. So maybe this is dangerous, like me commuting and listening to audiobooks, but do you all listen to audiobooks?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the funny thing, you don't? That's so cool.
I don't. I have like garbage audio retention. I'm trying it. I am actually listening to one right now that I'm trying it again because I want, you know, I'm such a fast skim reader too that it feels a lot slower to me. So I'm learning how to readjust my, you know, appreciation of, yep, this is slower and that's okay.
Yeah. So I'm a very slow visual reader. And I sometimes, when I do listen to audiobooks, it depends. So I go through phases. So sometimes I'm in the mood for audiobooks and sometimes I'm not in the mood at all. Like I don't want to have anything to do with them. I just want to read with my eyes. And sometimes I immersion read. And especially if it's with fantasy audiobooks, I cannot seem to do a good job with just listening to an audiobook and holding a picture in my head unless I see the words on the page. So I do immersion read sometimes. And I'm doing that right now with The Child Thief because, man, that audiobook narrator is phenomenal. Kirby Hayborn, amazing narrator. The way he does Peter's voice versus even the adult voices, it's just the most mind-blowing thing in the world to me. But yes, but I was going to say, sorry, what I was going to say is, Jordan, you did that video about how BookTube has influenced your reading. And I felt like, and I know Theo did a video like that today too. And I just think it's so funny because if we did a survey and we asked how many people got into audiobooks after getting into BookTube,
Yep.
I think Audible would like know where the money is being made.
Yeah. I listen to BookTube. I listen to audiobooks all day at work. So I'm an engineer, so I do like math all day. So I'm able to I'm not like reading a lot of words while I'm working, so I can math and listen to the story at the same time. So it's great.
Yeah.
I was thinking earlier today, it feels like almost like going to the theater. It doesn't feel like I'm reading. It's like it's a completely different experience.
Yeah.
Because it's being performed, right? And the guy, John Lee, I'm super impressed with his narration because he has accents for each of the characters, and they're not super different. It doesn't go so far as to feel cartoony. I think years ago when I tried an audiobook, it did feel quite cartoony because it was a bit overdone with the characters, but he's just got little tone of voice change, little accent change, and you know immediately, oh, it's that character, you know. And I'm really, really enjoying it. I kind of feel, because I've been attached to printed books for so long or Kindle, I kind of feel like I need to then read the book. Like go back and actually look at the words.
I have found if I try to listen to like one book in a series and try to read it again, I have a hard time connecting characters that I'm like reading visually versus what I heard, even though like obviously their name is the same, but like there's something about reading the characters on the page versus listening to it. Since it's so different, I feel like I'm always like just so confused. Like I'll switch to physically and I'm like, who are these characters?
Yeah.
Kev says Stephen Pacey. Is that a narrator? I assume that's
he's
a narrator.
an amazing narrator.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
is he the one that did First Law?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he's great. The First Law audiobooks are really good.
Yeah, he's probably one of the most famous. His Glocta voice versus the oh man, it's just I think even if you prefer reading visually and you love the First Law series, you don't have to listen to the whole series. Just listen to a little bit of Stephen Pacey just to appreciate it. Because it's so good.
I've been Josh just said he wants to try Lord of the Rings with Andy Serkis. I've been thinking exactly the same thing, Josh.
I'm so anti that recommendation
Wow.
because I listen to
Josh, just so you know, fuck you. Apparently, I didn't say it.
I know I'm being so mean. No, I haven't listened to the Andy Serkis one. I'm going to. But the thing is, last year for Two Towers and Return of the King, I listened to this graphic audio version that's free on Spotify. You don't even have to have a Spotify like pay a subscription. I don't pay for anything on Spotify. I have an account, but I use it for free. There is a graphic audio version of Lord of the Rings. It has the music from the film and everything, and the guy who does the character voices. I just can't imagine anybody doing it better. Even the Gollum voice, maybe it is Andy Serkis though, because it sounds just like Gollum from the movie. And the Treebeard voice is like the most insane thing I've ever heard. It is like death metal awesomeness. It is the coolest thing I've ever.
Death metal awesomeness is not a phrase I ever expected to hear describing Lord of the Rings.
I sound like the Charlie from Fairy Tale now.
Mondo's stupid.
That's actually one of the ways that I got the audiobook I'm listening to right now is Wuthering Heights, and Joanne Froggatt is the narrator, and she plays Anna in Downton Abbey. So her voice to me is very calming and I'm familiar, and that's actually helped me, which is one of the reasons why I was kind of thinking that I might try the Andy Serkis version of Lord of the Rings, because I'm like, all right, this is a voice that I recognize, it's familiar. I don't have to like try to get used to it. And so
I've been thinking about it purely because I mean I've read Lord of the Rings more than 10 times. I don't have any problems getting into the names of places and people and tracking what's going on and hearing a good performance of it. I actually, when I was a kid, I think I'd read Lord of the Rings, and then I discovered that my school had audio tapes. I can show you a picture of audio tapes, Jordan and Tori, if you've never heard of them. But,
nice.
they had like a big binder in the library that was full of audio tapes. And if you went and asked the librarian, she would give you a tape player and headphones, and you could listen to Lord of the Rings. It was the BBC production, so it was different actors for every character.
Oh, I think I've listened to part of that.
It was so charming. It would probably sound really corny and stupid to me now. I don't know. But back then as a kid, I loved it. Yeah. And then hearing that Andy Serkis, and I just discovered this, probably everybody who's into audiobooks already knows this, but I design software. So when I look at websites and software, I get really annoyed usually. And Audible totally shits me because their pricing structure is made in such a way that you pay a fair bit of money to get one book a month. And if you want more, you pay 2 or 3 times the price of a paperback to get another one. So I started talking to people on the Grimoire Discord and discovered Scribd.
Yeah, I use that.
Which is 10 a month, and you get access to their entire catalog.
Or just use the Libby app and use your library card.
Yeah,
I live in Germany.
That's fair. Good point.
Yeah.
Good point.
I also heard about that, and I signed up for the Berlin United Libraries, and I got a card and whatever. And they do have some English books, but very few. And I don't want to listen to Lord of the Rings in German or anything else in German. I hear more than enough German every day. But Scribd has the Lord of the Rings with Andy Serkis. So
okay,
if you're into that,
I might one of these days listen to the Andy Serkis one and then listen to the graphic audio one I'm talking about on Spotify, because I have the hardest time being convinced it's going to be better, but I might compare and contrast and see.
everybody, I mean, I even before I started audiobooking, I had heard that the Andy Serkis Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are amazing. So, you know.
The person who got me into the Spotify one is Books with Brittany, and she told me that she's listened to every version out there. I'm assuming Andy Serkis as well, and she swears that this one's the best. But I now want to know. Now I have to compare and contrast and see.
Yeah.
And then you can all let me. I can report back and say you all were right, and you can superior, or I could say you're all wrong. But
it doesn't have to be a matter of who's better or not. They can both be good.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that we have that available, though. And I mean, I appreciate that we have audiobooks, because we do have people in our community who are visually impaired, and they could be part of the discussion. Yeah. I know AP made a big rant about audiobooks on your discussion last time. And I agree with everything he said. I just think that, like, for me, I understand the experience is different, and I agree the experience is different. But at the same time, when I think back on my experience of a book after finishing it, to me, they're the same.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, it's all one picture in my head. Like, I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, I mean, they are a totally different experience. It is a performance.
Yeah.
And it's not doing what me looking at words on a page does. You know, it's doing something very different. But I mean, Raf is blind, and Raf is in Germany, and Raf prefers to read English things, even though his native language is German. And I feel so sorry for him constantly, because I've already only just in the last few days, now that I've started looking at audiobooks, I've discovered how hard it is to get certain things in English in Germany.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Licensing. It's all licensing deals. It's all about licensing deals. It's also with the streaming television services. There are things on Netflix that you can watch right now that I cannot. Netflix is not an international service. There is a Netflix Germany, and there are things that are not licensed for Germany. Or Prime Video. Prime Video is my favorite example. They have all sorts of stuff I would love to watch, but I don't want to fucking watch it in German. And they've got the dubbed German version only. Clint Eastwood Westerns. I love Clint Eastwood Westerns. The old Pale Rider and Two Mules for Sister Sarah and all of that. Outlaw Josie Wales. They've got all of them. None of them in English. So
that's such a shame. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting.
Anyway, we have been doing this for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I know that Jordan needs to go. I've had an absolute blast. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much
thank
for
you
coming
guys.
on.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it so much. This is so fun.
Absolutely. We shall certainly do it again. I want to do one of these with 4 people every month, and not make it too crazy a schedule, but I will be very happy to have any of you on anytime you want. And Jordan, when you're getting into Malazan, lean on me if you want.
Yeah, sure.
You can ask me, should I understand this anytime you want?
The video we recorded last night, I think, is going up on Alex's channel on Tuesday about the read along. So
yeah,
nice.
Cool. Excellent. Cool. And thank you everybody in the chat. It's been a pleasure having you. And I will see you all soon.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.